years. We would like to begin this work session meeting of the Provo Municipal Council. Today is Tuesday, October 12th. Time is 1:31 p.m. Meetings of the Municipal Council are now being held in hybrid fashion. Members of the public may continue to view council meetings on YouTube and Facebook, or they may attend in person in the council chambers at the Provo City Center. Elected officials, staff, and any presenters are either participating in the council chamber or by using Zoom webinar. The coronavirus pandemic is not yet over, but vaccines are available. We encourage everyone who's eligible to get vaccinated. We encourage all people to protect themselves and others by following the protocols set by the CDC and by our state and local health departments. Please stay safe and be kind. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking, to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. We have 3 council members here in the chambers, and I'm looking on my screen here. See, I believe we have all the other counselors for participating remotely. We also have Wayne Parker, our CEO, and other members of the administration and council staff here as well. The opening prayer this afternoon will be offered by Councilor Bill Fillmore.
Okay. Our beloved Heavenly Father, we gratefully bow our heads before Thee this afternoon and give thanks for our many blessings as citizens of the city of Provo. And otherwise, we thank Thee, Heavenly Father, for the opportunity we have to serve the city. We pray that Thou will bless and guide our deliberations by Thy Holy Spirit. We pray that Thou bless us to be thoughtful and courteous and reach those decisions in the best interest of our citizens. We thank Thee, Father, for the blessings we have of living in this free land, and pray that Thou might bless our nation, that we might maintain those freedoms, that our leaders might be wise and responsible. Again, we thank Thee for all good things in our lives and invite Thy Spirit in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. If you're participating via Zoom, please use the raised hand function to indicate that you would like to speak. Please wait to speak until you're called upon by the chair. If you're sitting at the dais in the council chamber, you'll need to raise your actual hand instead of clicking an option in Zoom. Muting and unmuting your microphone will need to be done with the red buttons at the dais instead of on the computer. And before we begin with our business, I have a announcement that may be of interest to members of the public. I'd like to acknowledge and congratulate Mayor Kafusi, who was elected second vice president of the Utah League of Cities and Towns at its annual convention a week or so ago. She's been on the board of directors of ULCT for the past couple of years. And another announcement of note is that the Provo Parks and Recreation Department won a prestigious national award recently, which we'll learn more about at our next regular meeting on October 26th. The first item of business for today is approval of minutes. It's proposed that we approve the following minutes from January 29th, 2008, May 13th, 2008, May 13th, 2009, joint meeting with Provo School Board, May 19th, 2009, study meeting, September 7th, 2021, council meeting, September 21st, 2021 work meeting. Mr. Strachan, do you want to make any comment about the dates on some of those?
I do. And those dates are not incorrect. Elizabeth, when she was doing some review of some of our records, discovered a cache of minute or some recordings of some meetings, and then when she checked, discovered that no minutes had been prepared or adopted, going back to those. And I think there's a couple, two or three more to come, but those are what those are. And we just wanted to formalize them by adopting them.
Thank you. And thank you for your thoroughness in catching that, Elizabeth. Are there any objections or requested changes to any of those minutes? Seeing none, I'll declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. We'll now move on to item number 1, which is a presentation regarding GRAMA in relation to public and confidential records retained by the city and the process on how they're made public. And I understand this item will be presented both by Amanda Erkenbrack, Director of Customer Service, and Brian Jones, City Attorney. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you an overview of the process, and then once I'm finished, Brian can jump in. Sorry, is that better? Can you hear me now? I'll just give an overview of the process, and then after I'm finished, Brian can jump in and review a few of the legal points. Do I have a clicker? There we go. Doesn't seem to work. There we go. Okay, so GRAMA, the intent of GRAMA, and it's known on a broader level as FOIA, or Freedom of Information Act. The intent is both for the public to access public documents while also protecting the public's right, or a person's right to privacy. So things like social security numbers and home addresses and email addresses and phone numbers aren't disclosed in that process. Just a really brief overview of what a record is. A record is not, number one, I would say it's not a request for information. We sometimes will get requests that say, I'd like to know who did this or who applied for that. That's not necessarily a request for a record. That information might be found on a record. So we just help the requester to get to the point of knowing what record they're actually asking for. So these are typically books, letters, documents, reports. It can be emails. We get a lot of requests for emails, a text message sometimes. But it's not personal communication. If I text Wayne and ask how his weekend was, that's not a public record. A temporary draft, unless it's used in making a decision, books in a library, and in most cases, a daily calendar. One key point on that is if it's reproducible. If it's reproducible, it's typically considered a record. So to make a request, we just need a few things. It is a person's name, mailing address, phone number, and then a description of the record that they're requesting that's described reasonably. Oftentimes we'll get a request that's just too broad for us to even know what we're looking for. So then we start communicating with the requester to narrow that scope. You can make a request a number of ways. On the website, which is the number one way that requests come in, by email or mail. You can fax it if you can find a fax machine somewhere. You can come in and fill out a form in our office, or there's also a state portal where those can be submitted. Like I mentioned before, the number one way that we received the request is on the portal. It's just provo.org/GRAMA. It's a fairly straightforward form. People can just fill it out and hit submit, and we're notified within a matter of minutes. So pretty efficient. From that point, once someone has submitted the request, it comes in and it's reviewed by myself or Janine or whoever's in that recorder role. And then we coordinate with the department, or sometimes it's multiple departments, to get those records. And this is more, it shows it in a straight process. It's really more of a collaborative effort between all of us, between legal, the department, the recorder's office. But we consider the record and ask ourselves the question, is it public? A record can be classified a number of ways. It can be public, private, protected, or controlled. So we work together oftentimes with legal as needed, and we classify the record and then respond accordingly. So this is just a really simplified workflow showing what happens after the request is submitted. We ask, does the record exist, or do we have the record? Sometimes we get requests that are actually not for Provo City records. They might belong to Utah County or someone else. So in that case, we would refer the record. If we do have it, we go through the classification process, which I'll talk about in just a moment. If it's public, we ask ourselves, is everything contained within that record public? Because sometimes we'll have Maybe it's someone's home address or someone's social security number, something like that, that we need to redact or remove from that. So we go through that process to make sure that everything that's being given to the public is considered a public record. If the record in its entirety is not public, then we would deny the request and notify the requester. Otherwise, we go ahead and fulfill that request and send the records off to the requester. Usually that's done electronically. In the event we do deny a request, they have the option. It's not very common, but they can appeal the denial. The appeals will go to the mayor. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. But it doesn't happen too often. We also have a local appeals board with 3 people who sit on that. They've actually never held a meeting. They've never had to. So that tells me that we're doing a pretty good job. So as I mentioned before, the classifications are private, controlled, and protected. These are some really general examples of what might be considered private. The private records we see requested most often have to do with employee type records, something that might include someone's social security number, tax deductions. It could be a criminal background check. It could be something that pertains to an undercover law enforcement personnel. A controlled record is usually medical or psychiatric. That might be when we have police officers that apply and they have to have their psychological profile or background, whatever they call that. That might be an example of a record that's controlled, or if releasing the record violates HIPAA. And then protected records, that's what we see most often. Sometimes those are attorney-client privilege. Sometimes it could be a closed meeting set of minutes or recordings. A person's home address and phone number, as I've mentioned several times. Also, we get requests for responses to bids. Sometimes those can cause competitive damage to that vendor. So those can be also classified as protected if properly handled. Just to give you an idea of what's happening with GRAMA, we're currently averaging, I just updated this last night, 33 requests per month. It doesn't sound like a lot, but if you look at where we were even 5-6 years ago, it's increased significantly. Several things have happened. One is that we made the form available online. It's easier to use. People know it's there. Another is that rather than someone coming into the front counter and asking for a record and us just handing it over, we've gotten in the habit of making them go through the formal process. So, and it's just becoming more widely known. So there's a number of reasons that it's increasing. We do charge fees if necessary. It's typically just the lowest wage of the employee with the skill necessary to perform the work. So in the case of an office that has an assistant, if that assistant is able to print the record and handle it, it's usually their wage. But we try to be really, really careful about if we can do it really quickly and just provide it for free, that's what we try to do. That's what we aim for. And then, as I mentioned, this is an example of the text someone might see if their request is denied. We have to tell them how they can make an appeal and what that process looks like. Once the appeal is made, the mayor works with legal or whoever necessary to review the record and respond accordingly, or put someone like Wayne in charge of responding to that appeal. So that's a really high level overview, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or just turn it over to Brian.
Are there any questions for Amanda?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. That was great. Now, as counselors, as you know, we're required by state law to do annual training on Open Meetings Act. And often when we do that training, we also cover GRAMA. And we did that training earlier in the year. But one of the things that Amanda and I talked about in preparation for this is that training, because I've been the one that's doing it, usually focuses on kind of a summary of the law and not so much the process that is actually followed in the city. And so I appreciate Amanda walking through that, because I think that's helpful to understand what the process is. Just a couple, I was asked by council leadership to maybe give some practical advice about handling information and records. And so I just had a couple of preliminary comments. I wanted to piggyback off of what Amanda had said, and then I'll make a couple comments about that, which shall also be pretty short. First one is, despite the training that I give every year, where I kind of run through what GRAMA means, and the training that Elizabeth just did that summarizes the law, it's actually exceptionally complicated. If you pull out the Utah Code annotated, and look up the Government Records and Management Act, it's 82 pages long. So to try to summarize that in 4 or 5 slides and try to capture all of it, is pretty difficult. If you look at Section 305, which is the section that gives the classifications of protected records, there are, at latest count, more than 75 different categories of protected records, spanning 10 pages of the text of the code. And so that's one of the reasons why we've gotten into the habit, like Amanda just mentioned, of suggesting that all records should be accessed when possible through a GRAMA request. And that gives a few protections both to the city and to the individual employees or officials who are being asked for the record. GRAMA includes criminal penalties for both intentional release and intentional refusal to release records that are public under, or, well, let me back up and say intentional release of records that are protected, private, or controlled, and intentional refusal to release records that are classified as public under the statute. So one reason why we like records to be released through the GRAMA request process is it gives protection to individual employees. They're not under scrutiny for making that decision, but there's a formal process for that decision to be made. And again, and then we, as Amanda mentioned, you come across issues like redaction. 90% of a given record might be public, but the 10% that's private needs to be redacted. And again, the individual employee is protected by having that formal process be followed. Additionally, it gives us a record of the request. It gives us a record of the fact that we released or didn't release the record and what the reasoning was. And so all of those things make the GRAMA request process very important for handling city records. Additionally, we have a lot of records, both internally in the city, or let me say it this way instead. We have a lot of records in the city that have been shared. And when I say shared, that might mean one department created the record and they're sharing it with another department. Or we might have a record that Provo City didn't even create, but it's been shared with us by another governmental entity. And one of the sure ways to shut down that sharing is if those records are shared outside of the process or without the other entity or department being aware of how they're used or those kind of things. So we want to follow the process and follow the rules to protect the city, to protect the employees, and to try to actually keep transparency and open communication viable. So the two comments that I wanted to make in regard to the questions that I was asked by council leadership are, again, going back to what Amanda said, that information and records aren't necessarily the same thing. You may receive, as a counselor, you may come into possession of information by attending a meeting, by having a conversation, by having a phone call. You can come into possession of information in a lot of different ways. That information or knowledge that you might have is not in and of itself a record. The record is the reproducible physical object or digital object, as the case may be, where that information might be stored. GRAMA applies to records, not to information. So that's kind of one threshold question that may come up sometimes when you're asked for something is, are you being asked to answer a question, or are you being asked to share a document, recording, voicemail, etc.? GRAMA applies to the second, not to the first. However, the second principle that I wanted to talk about applies to both information and records. And that really has to do with ownership and working with each other to both follow the rules and to preserve that open sharing of communication that I just talked about. And so as a general guideline, the question I was asked by council leadership is, what we get asked for information as counselors by constituents all the time. information and or records, how should we go about responding to those at a practical level? And I indicated to Chair Sewell and Vice Chair Shipley that my off-the-cuff response to that is actually very simple, which is, and it's just this, and this applies across the city, not just to the council, but to any department. If your department created the information or created the record, then your department gets to decide how to use it and who to share it with. If you got it from somebody else, you better check with them before you share it or release it. And so when I was talking with him about it, I gave an example that I've been using the last week or so when I've been discussing this with people, and it goes like this. Let's say, for example, that you are, as a counselor, are contacted by a constituent who says, there's a really bad traffic problem at this intersection in my neighborhood. I really want you to do something about it. And so you turn around and you forward that email to Dave Decker in Public Works and say, do you have any information that I can share with this constituent about their request? And Dave Decker responds to you and says, yeah, that's a great question. Here's the data that we have about accidents at that intersection that you're welcome to pass along to them. In that case, it's pretty clear. You get to pass that along and you can forward the email, do what you want with it. The other approach is you might get that same exact question from a constituent and you might send an email to Dave Decker and say, hey, I was just wondering, could you give me any data about accidents at this intersection? And my advice is when you get the response to that, that information is for you alone until you write back to Dave and say, hey, that was great information. That really helped me understand the issue. Can I share that? Because you're not the originating department, until you get that permission, I think that information needs to be held personally until it's either shared in a public meeting or until you've contacted the department. And again, as I said in a discussion earlier today, that I'm not giving that advice just to the council. I gave that advice to the directors of all the departments across the city. And I gave another example. So for instance, if the city attorney from Orem contacts me and asks me for a copy of a drafted template for a certain type of agreement that my office is working on, I'm generally happy to just send that to them and say, yeah, we created that in my department. I know exactly what this document is. I know what it's for. I'm happy to share it with you and you go use it for what you want. If the city attorney from Orem contacts me and says, I hear that you've been working on this issue with your public works department, and our public works department is having the same issue. Can you share with me the policy that they drafted to deal with this problem? Then my response would be, well, let me talk to public works and see if they're okay, or have your public works director reach out to my public works director and see if they're okay with that being shared. So that's kind of the general rule, the general principle that I talked about with council leadership in response to the question they asked me. But I'm happy to answer any questions, that's all I had prepared for today.
Any questions for Mr. Jones? Not seeing any. That was really helpful, I thought, Amanda and Brian. I actually learned an awful lot, so thank you very much. I hope staff and other counselors found it helpful as well. Thank you. All right, let's move on to item number 2, which is a presentation regarding an update on the Bridal Falls feasibility study. And this item is to be presented by Mike Long, Utah Division of Parks and Recreation, and Kathy Whedon of CRSA.
Hi, I'm Kathy
Welcome.
Wheaton from CRSA. Thanks for having me. Mike was going to be in his car, so he's probably joining us by phone, potentially. He's out there somewhere in the digital world, and we'll have him jump in if we have any questions from you all. So we are the consultant hired by the state to look at the question that came from the legislature to to the department that asks the question, should Bridal Veil Falls be set aside as a state park, a state recreation area, or state monument, or be retained as it is by the county? And so that is the study we've taken on. We've been working on the project for a while. You guys have some information from us. Thank you for bringing it up, even though we didn't send it to you. That's great. Maybe we can just look at this a little bit. We cast a wide net early on, just looking at the history of the project and its current land use, some of the work that's going on by the county to look at updates to the site and potential future development that might happen there. The parcel that's owned by the county is the specific study area. So it is literally just a few acres at the bottom of Bridal Veil Falls that extend to the road and across the river. So that land use, of course, has a lot of encumbrances by other parties, including UDOT, has access and control of the bike path, the frontage road, as well as the highway, which crosses this parcel, water access for the city and both the water district. So there's lots of things happening on the site, as well as the public typically can't answer the question, who owns Bridal Veil Falls or the Bridal Veil Falls access? In many cases, they arrive to walk to the Bridal Veil Falls, they get off the highway, they come to the park, which is owned by the city, and walk up the trail and then arrive at the county parcel. And so rarely do they know if they're in the county, if they're on city land, or if they're on county land. So some of the things we've been trying to discern is how people use the site, how people access the site, what they like about the site, what would they like, if anything changed about the site, what the future might look like. And in doing that, we, in the last month, have kind of cast a wide net on the public information gathering. So 2 weeks ago, we were here. Thank you to the city for hosting us at the Recreation Center. We had an outreach meeting, which we had folks come to, that was held in the evening. And this coming Saturday, we'll have another public outreach meeting on site from noon until 4 p.m. And so the goal is really to ask the public what they see as the value of the site and what they would like to see in its future land use. And that's the other reason that we're here today, is to talk to you a little bit about what the council sees as the future of the parcel, any desires that you have that you would like us to take back to the division and the Department of Natural Resources, and answer any questions you have about the study and how it's ongoing, and any questions that you might need answered for your constituents. So I don't want to take up too much time.
Any questions? Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for doing this work. I'm just curious, what the status is. I know that there was something like 1,000 respondents to the survey. Do you know what the number is now?
Yep, so we're almost at 3,000 starting today. So hoping to get over that soon. I think I sent something to all of you just directly giving you some updates to what the survey looks like. So the survey's been our way of being able to reach out to constituents across the state and then hold public information sessions here in the county so that we have a chance to hear from people one-on-one. So the survey's been going well, but 3,000 people out of the population we have in the state we think is small. We would love to see a few thousand people, tens of thousands of people respond to the survey and be able to give us some more input. Most broadly, we have respondents coming from Utah County. The next group of respondents come from Salt Lake City. So we would love to see kind of a broader feedback to the survey. We are doing our best to kind of get that into other municipalities and counties' hands, other kind of governmental agencies' hands so they can respond. But so far, the survey response has really been maybe what we expected, which is we love the falls and we love the site. It holds a great deal of history and interest to ourselves and our families. We've been going there a long time and we would like to continue to go there. We have a lot of the respondents to the survey who surprise me frequent the site very, frequently. They are there, on a weekly basis or sometimes once a month, which is a lot of visits. So people are riding their bikes up the canyon. They're going there with their family. It's something that's part of their daily activities. And many of the respondents want the site to remain kind of as it is today, particularly undeveloped, not looking at significant development, but more amenities that make the visit more pleasant. So many cases, those requests are for restrooms, better and more parking, better access to amenities such as picnic tables, places to sit down, maybe some signage, better understanding of the history of the site, those kinds of things, but no, keen, large scale requests in general for larger development than that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm curious to know if that means that most of them are leaning away from a state park and either do nothing or a state monument that doesn't require any fees or any sort of entry.
Yeah, so on the fees question, I can answer that. There is a general perspective that if fees go to helping maintain the site, people don't mind fees. But fees are difficult to apply to this site. It's a very small site. As you know, it's a very porous site. It's not a site that you can really have great control over a fee. So whether people want a fee or not, the question is then on funding. So it seems like people are willing to support funding in some way, shape, or form to make sure that the site is well maintained. And so that's probably a better or different question than fees. We have a lot of people saying they don't want fees, but when asked specifically, would you be willing to support funding that would go to these things, restroom, all the things that I just mentioned, almost everyone says yes. So then the question is, how would those funds get into somebody's hands who would manage and maintain the site? I think the question about land use and land use designation is a difficult one that we found in the survey. And we've even found it when we were in public with folks who had questions, which is exactly what does it mean to have a state park or a state monument or another land use that would be in state control, or what does it mean to continue to have the property in county's hands? And we've tried to answer these questions, but they are in some ways nebulous. A state park, currently state parks are asked by the legislature to be self-funded, which is there needs to be some amenity there which will help fund kind of the management and activities that happen on the site. And that's a difficult thing and a very small parcel that's very porous. So it doesn't seem like even if people are supporting that, and it is probably the lowest support, that wouldn't be possible. The next one is state monument, which is a designation of a land or land use that really doesn't need to have a fee attached to it, but that would be managed by the state. And then the question is, what would the state management look like? And so that's really the next question, which is what would change on the site that would make it a benefit to the users by putting it in the state's hands rather than the county's hands. And at this point in time, we don't see a huge difference. There's not a lot that the state's going to manage on the site that's going to be different than the way the county manages it. And the bonus so far on the way the county has a funding mechanism is that they do have funds that they can appropriate, while it may not be so easy on the state side to appropriate funds for a monument, but maybe possible. And that has been kind of the second most chosen component piece of land use designation. But the one that's been the strongest under the kind of the state management is a state recreation area. And so what we've probably heard this most strongly is, could there be something that happens in a broader Provo Canyon way that preserves the land use across the canyon? And that's not part of the purview of our study, but it is something that we'll take back to the legislature and say, there is significant use and there's significant interest in what does the future of Provo Canyon look like in the long run. There isn't currently a state designation or definition for recreation area, although there are 2 state recreation areas. So that will happen. Those designations will be developed. We can better answer the question whether one of those may be a more appropriate or apt way of designating the land. There is, between that kind of state recreation area and owned by the county, those are the 2 most highly voted for kind of perspectives of the public so far.
Yeah, I've been very interested in the idea of state management, but I am not interested at all in making it onerous for the users, and I agree. I think the space is so small. I've been worried about a fee getting in the way of people's ability to just freely enjoy it and use it and not feel like it's cumbersome in any way, since it is so easily accessible through all these different public means. So anyway, it sounds like the survey is at least coinciding with my conversations with people, and my sense of it is that, people very much value it and want it to be properly maintained and maybe improved, improve some safety issues, but without the cumbersome qualities of some sort of gate or some sort of fee that ends up disrupting that experience.
Exactly. And I think the state feels the same way, that they are more than supportive of making sure the site is used in its highest and best use possible. They are recreationalists. They like people to be outdoors, but if this isn't the best thing to be under state control, then they are the first to raise their hand and say, I think there may be other ways to go that really can preserve this site. I think one of the other conversations we've had with the public is just on the conservation easement. It seems when we talk to people that they know that there's a conservation easement, don't really understand what the conservation easement means. So I'm trying to do a little bit more introduction to the conservation easement, what the limitations over time are for development on the land, and what the county's plans have been. And we've encouraged the county to be maybe a little bit more public or transparent about, some of the funding that's currently been set forward for this winter to next spring to put in a pit toilet on their site, and encourage the public to understand kind of what's coming up and already been planned for and has been appropriated for some improvements to the site, so that people see those things coming and feel that the county has been engaged in making their process transparent as well.
Thank you.
Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, two things. First, I just wanted to express my support for doing a regional plan for the entire canyon. I think that Utah County and Wasatch County and Provo and Orem and a number of jurisdictions, the Forest Service, UDOT, et cetera, would have a sincere interest in collaborating and in creating a plan for that entire canyon. I don't think we want the headaches that people are experiencing in the Cottonwood Canyons right now. And I think we have the opportunity to get ahead of some of those headaches and major issues. It's way beyond headaches. So that's a point to my fellow councilors, is that I think we should start preparing for a multi-jurisdictional plan to address or prepare for or preempt some of the issues that could occur in Provo Canyon. And then my second point is a simple question to the consultants at CRSA. If you haven't received the council's unanimous resolution from, I think, last November or December in regards to Bridal Falls, would you let us know, and we can get the staff to send that to you? I think it summarizes the council's sentiments from almost a year ago.
We would love to see a copy of that. That'd be great. I think we've read parts of it in council meetings, but anything that you could get to us would be great.
Staff could follow up getting that to them. We'd appreciate it. Thank you. Are there other questions? Mr. Hanley.
Sorry, I just a follow-up comment from what Ms. Ellsworth was saying, so that you're aware, we have plans to develop our own foothills and canyon plan for the city. And that will involve thinking in our, from the point of view of municipal stewardship, what our role would be in preserving and protecting and enhancing the city properties at Provo Canyon, South Fork Canyon. So it would be lovely to have that work in concert with some sort of regional plan.
Excellent. Yeah, we agree. We've learned a lot through this process with just the stakeholders on this parcel of property, and can see that these are the same kinds of potential conflicts that can arise on any property. One can't do probably anything in this canyon without a Forest Service and UDOT conversation, or at least those parties being at the table thinking about planning. We thank Councillor Ellsworth for joining us, and public outreach, and the rest of you for being able to send folks our way to participate in this process. It's been really fun. We've heard from a lot of people who are very passionate about what the future of the site looks like. And we want to make sure that we're moving that forward. So thank you so much for having me. We're always open. We will be in front of the legislature in the month of November, making our recommendations. So, and you are always more than welcome to reach out to me or to Mike Long with the division. I think you have both of our contact information, but we're happy to answer any questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item number 3, which is a presentation from the Housing Committee regarding an ordinance change for ADUs to comply with Utah state law. And this item is to be presented by John Magnus, Policy Analyst, and Robert Mills, Planning Supervisor.
Good afternoon, Council. We were here at the last work meeting discussing the same issues. We give you the presentation on what HB 82 does, how we're trying to address it. Today, what I want to talk about is the idea that somehow accessory dwelling units are for the college, and it's not. Last week, I've been reading nothing about except accessory dwelling units and papers on student housing, academic research. What the research shows is what we can expect is in the first year, most of the ADUs we will receive will be people coming into compliance who have them illegally now. And if they are allowed to come into compliance, they will. By the second year, what we'll see most likely are elderly people taking advantage of it who want to stay in their home, want to age in their home. This is a way for them to afford it. It also gives them companionship, someone they can rely on. The third year, what we're going to probably see are more and more people who are getting accessory dwelling units, not for rental income, but because they're trying to help family members. And then by that fourth year, we should start seeing ADUs come online as a rental income stream. The reason being, the literature is saying, is that there's a lag time between when you change your ordinances and the information getting out into the community. So it will take a few years for the community to understand what they can do and can't do. There's also barriers. Our parking is going to be the greatest barrier to it. Second barrier is going to be cost and knowledge on actually how to come to the city and apply for a permit to create one of these. So we're trying to divorce the two. I know it's very hard because we have BYU here and it does. But the research on student housing, yes, they will use accessory dwelling units. But because of what BYU is planning to do in the next fall, releasing them from the radius, what we should see is right now we have an artificial confinement. The students are confined to a geographical area, which lets those apartments and landlords have a monopoly on the students. With the literature showing that most students want to live within 20 minutes of a university, either driving or walking. So if they have a car, they'll move away. If they don't want to be more than 20 minutes away from the university. They feel like they can walk in that time. I would say that because of the cost of the housing there and the private housing they have over by UVU, we will see some of our students move away, which should drive down cost. UNR had done this several years ago. They released their students from their student housing on campus. And what happened is private developers came in north of campus and built big apartment complexes and gave amenities the students wanted. Pools, parking, barbecue, one person per room. And they were comparable to the universities charging for on-campus. The universities now had to reduce their costs and they're shutting their dorms down because they've lost so many students to the private apartment buildings. And again, those apartments were built within 20 minutes, a 20-minute walk from those apartment buildings down to the campus. So they fit that model. So as we go forward, I know it's important. The BYU does have an outweighed measurement on us, but this is not to deal with student housing. This is to deal with affordable housing. Makes both people who can afford a house, it stretches them a little better because if they can rent out the bottom part of their apartment or their house as an apartment, that extra income can help them make the mortgage payment, especially in lean times. On the other hand, it is a more affordable housing per square foot than an apartment for people who want to live in those houses. So it helps both sides of this equation. And it's just one tool. It's not like everybody's going to go out and start having accessory dwelling units in their houses. The map before you shows you a 1 mile radius around the university. Those hashed in marks to the east of the university are what we would pick up if we kept the A overlay within a mile. That is not enough. We are required to have 33% of our allowable our primarily zoned residential to have accessory dwelling units. Can you bring up map 2? Map 2, the blue circle is now 2-mile radius. Even with all its hashed in areas, we come up to 1,100 acres. We need to get to 1,900 acres. So using the university and drawing circles out, you'll see that we have to get further and further out, probably out to the 3-mile marker. Problem is, most of the property around the university is already zoned RC or has an ARS overlay. So we're not picking up enough acreage just by concentrically going out from the university. The guiding principle for the housing committee was 1, flexibility, and 2, to make this process easy. What they decided was to eliminate the A&S overlay and to allow it in all R1 zones. This is what you're going to consider today. Robert Millis is going to run through the actual ordinance with you step by step. We have a few decision points that we need made so we can take this on to the planning commission. And we'd like to try to get it done by Thursday of this week so we can get on the next planning commission and get the process started, because it will still have to come back to the council for final approval because it is an ordinance amendment.
All right. Before I begin, council, I just want to say personally how glad I am that we're talking about this. This is something that I've wanted to talk about for many years, and I'm glad we're at this point. I think it's really important, and we're excited to get your feedback and some of your recommendations and give us some direction. So I'm going to go over a little bit of information, kind of what we talked about last time, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page with this. So today, just a recap of current context, then the additional requirements from HB 82. I'm going to summarize what the Housing Committee is proposing. If you would like a specific copy of the actual ordinance and the text and everything, I'm going to rely on Malia or John to bring that up. And then get your council recommendations and then just talk about that timeline. So again, this is what the current context allows. It has to either to have an accessory dwelling unit, you need to be in a zone that allows that, which is the RC zone, or in an overlay zone, which is the A or the S. ADUs are allowed in Ag 1 and the residential agricultural zone, but we don't have any overlays in those zones currently. This is what our current percentages allow for. So ADUs are currently allowed in approximately 20% of areas in Provo. HB 82 requires 33%. And then to comply, we need to add at a minimum an additional 13%. Yes, Mr. Henley.
I just want to make sure that the public is clear, and maybe I'm clear too, because I keep hearing they are allowing ADUs in 33%. That's as a minimum, right? They're saying it must be at least 33%.
So the way that the language is written is we as a city have the ability to exempt 67% of our residential areas.
Lately in the packets,
sense?
it hasn't said that explicitly, and it might be helpful to say to allow as a minimum 33% or something like that so that it's clear. Anyway.
That's a very important point. So at a minimum, we have to have 33%, which translates to an additional 13% of our primarily zoned residential areas in the city. So I just want to kind of do a summation of this proposed language. I saw that all of you have it in your packets, but just to kind of give you the context of this, the recommendation is basically for the most permissive language that we would allow for accessory dwelling units. And then we're coming to you as council members to see what is comfortable to you if we need to whittle that down or whatever that is. But in summary, this language changes the language that we refer to these as. We're just using accessory dwelling units now. It does remove the S and the A overlay, and then it allows ADUs as an accessory permitted use in all R1 residential agriculture, RC, which is no change, and then all A1 zones. So, and then it removes the requirement for an internal connection for internal accessory dwelling units. That's something that we'll need to talk about. Councilmember Harding, I'm sure, wants to talk about that. It removes the 20-foot height limitation on ADUs and accessory structures, which is something that we already have, but then it confines that accessory structure to be no taller or larger than the existing dwelling unit. Changes the occupancy of an ADU from no more than 2 unrelated individuals with or without children to no more than 3 unrelated people. Somebody have a question about that?
Mr. Strachan.
I just wanted to mention for the council's benefit, historically, this council, or maybe not this term of the council, but this Provo City Council and other university towns have argued strenuously for a number of things that are being proposed to change here. One of which is the going from 2 unrelated adults to 3. That's been a common limitation that's been allowed in cities with colleges or universities. And then the other one that the Provo City Council has argued for in the past years is the limitation on how much of the city is subject to accessory dwelling units. So just in terms of a historical concept, I don't have a position on either one. I just wanted to remind the council, as you consider, there have been reasons why in terms of protection of neighborhoods and trying to constrain where people, especially the student population, lives, et cetera, et cetera. But just keep in mind in the context that some of these changes are significant changes for what this council has argued for decades.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So just to briefly go through the rest of these really quickly, these next 2 are just clarifying points that addresses for ADUs will be assigned by Provo City. That wasn't clear in the text beforehand. For parking, this isn't a change to the amount of parking required. It just clarifies that any parking in the front yard can only be on an actual driveway that leads to required covered parking. That was a little bit ambiguous before. And then it actually removes the language regulating the number of kitchens. This proposed amendment would actually allow for ADUs in about 74% of the residential areas of our city. So it still does not permit them in zones that are like LDR or VLDR, HDR, MDR, those ones, just the R1 zones. Things that are not changing with this, you can still only have 1 ADU per single family dwelling. It must be owner occupied. That's a current requirement that is carrying over. The ADU cannot alter the appearance of the structure as a single family dwelling. And then there has to be a minimum of 4 parking stalls if you're establishing an accessory dwelling unit, but any vehicle associated with the property has to have an off-street parking space. Mr. Sewell.
Councilor Ellsworth has a question for you.
Yes.
I don't have a question as much as I have comments, so I can wait until Robert's done.
Okay. I have a few more slides and then, go ahead.
About this slide, must be owner occupied, and maybe you'll want to get to this later, but is this going to create a massive zoning enforcement problem is my question. If we're going from 20 to 74%, the number of RDLs that are now required in the city, I mean, obviously not everyone's going to use this, but
right.
But if there's a significant jump in number, what are we going to be able to do to ensure that it is actually owner occupied?
So based on the information that we've had from our zoning administration, the research that John has done, this seems like a manageable jump. We know that there are ADUs in areas already that don't permit them that's a given in our city. And given our current housing situation, we know that that's going to become more prevalent. And currently, the only option that people have for compliance is that they have to just remove it. And so the idea of coming into compliance isn't very appealing, because that means that these people are losing out on their accessory dwelling unit. This actually provides a mechanism for these people to come into compliance. What we want to make sure is that they're safe. That's obviously going to require more inspections and things like that. But like John said, our anticipation is that over the next few years, most of these will be just those that are coming into compliance that already exist. And so what I've been told is that the burden doesn't seem onerous. There will be increased work, but everybody seems to feel like they can handle it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess I'm just worried about I guess I'm just worried about the longer term possibility that we end up with more and more, not so much because you're describing people who are out of compliance who would be in compliance if this law is in existence. I'm talking about, predatory landlords who are not intending to ever occupy the unit. Are we more vulnerable to that? And if so, how are we going to know that somebody's owner occupied?
So I think that is a concern, and the answer that I have to that is that this idea of making sure that it's owner occupied does seem to be self-regulating. That's the way that our current system is more complaint based. So in situations where both units are being rented out, that does become more obvious to the neighbors around them. They're made more aware of that. It does take a significant amount of effort to do occupancy enforcement. But I think that the other thing to consider as well, and maybe Ms. Ellsworth is going to talk about this, but the other thing to consider as well is that as their prevalence, as their allowability increases, the rate of non-compliance would likely go down. The demand of it goes down. And so that's why that there's some assurance that it won't be as onerous as it might appear. Does that help, Mr. Henley? Okay.
Robert.
Yes.
Would it be all right if you went to the previous slide for a second?
You bet.
Okay, so this looks alarming, and I apologize, Robert, to insert this comment here, but it looks alarming to say that 74% of the areas of the city zoned primarily for residential use would permit ADUs. However, every other city in the state, Pleasant Grove, Panguitch, Tokerville, all of them have to permit ADUs in 75% of their cities. So this is not that dramatic, and it won't become dramatic immediately. It won't become dramatic overnight or in a year or two, in my opinion, even though that number looks dramatic. Is that right, Robert?
That's correct.
Okay, I just wanted to give some context there.
Yeah, that's really good context.
Councillor Harding.
Thank you. The other thing is this this new state law gives us additional enforcement tools, including a fairly hefty fines, and we can lien the properties. We can put a lien on the property, and also, I think we've seen this elsewhere. In our broader society, that at times by legalizing and regulating it brings things above the table, and so there's reason to believe that enforcement will be a lot better if people are worried about losing their license. I mean, there's just tools here once it's legal and regulated, and new tools that the state has given us. So I'm confident that we can rise to the challenge.
Councillor Fillmore.
Thank you, Chair Sewell. Robert, I had two questions. I think one may have been answered. My initial concern was similar to what Councilman Henley has raised. That is the potential enforcement problem. What penalties are proposed, or what are the statutory penalties to put some sting in a violation?
That's a great question. And actually the HB 82, like was mentioned by Councillor Harding, does allow for some more stringent enforcement, and we can put a lien against the property, and the fine for non-compliance is actually quite a bit more. Let me have John answer that question for you, Councillor Fillmore.
Councilor Fillmore. So the first HB 82 lays out a scheme for us to use to get compliance, matter of hearings. But at the end of the day, what it is, we get $100 a day fine, and we can put a lien on the property. So when that property is sold, we will be paid. So it's not a great deterrent, but it is a deterrent, and $100 a day, that after a month, that's $3,000. That's more than what they're capturing rents. So it would behoove them to come into compliance quickly with us. Otherwise, they'll be losing money even if they do have it rented out.
Okay, well, John, before you leave, so that's helpful. So is that a matter of state law, or is that something that we need to adopt as a city ordinance, the $100?
It's in HB 82. I think we're going to have to adopt that. Marcus?
So in other words, it's allowed, but it's up to us if we adopt it.
Right. They have a whole part of the section lays out what we can do to regulate these.
Okay. Second.
So we already have in Title 17 of our code a similar scheme for administrative citations where we can fine people daily for violations of, for example, not having a rental dwelling license or any violation of Title 14 of our code, for example. So we have a similar scheme. It's not quite, it is something that needs updating. It's old enough that the dollar figures need to be updated. But we have a similar scheme in place right now, but we would just want to update the numbers because it's over 20 years old and the dollar figures are a bit out of date.
Okay, does our ordinance anticipate a change in the methodology for discerning non-compliance?
So our current ordinance just is for any violation of city code. So it's based on a civil preponderance of the evidence standard. We would you'd prove it in an administrative hearing. So it wouldn't require any changes.
Okay, I'm sorry. That wasn't quite my question.
Oh,
my
sorry.
question is, does the proposed ordinance have a scheme for discovering violations other than just waiting for somebody to call us?
The ordinance doesn't require that. It's just a matter of policy that we do a complaint based, I think, based on resources that we have. If you wanted more proactive enforcement, I think that would require more staff in order to enforce it that way. Currently, again, the reason we do it on a complaint basis is for staffing reasons and resource reasons, not because we're required by law. We could have code enforcement officers going out there and proactively enforcing the code. That's simply a policy decision not to do it that way.
Well, I asked that question because the council appropriated a good amount of money to hire additional compliance officers for your department. And if you're saying you're going to rely on the same old method, just waiting for complaints to come in from third parties, I'm not sure that's what the council had in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a better question addressed at Community and Neighborhood Services. Yeah, again, that's a policy decision ultimately from Community and Neighborhood Services and the mayor regarding that. But we can certainly discuss if the council feels like policy would like to have input on policy changes. But I think that's an administrative executive decision that's been made.
All right. One more question for Robert Mills. Robert, it looks like you and the committee have been very thorough in approaching this and anticipating various arguments against it. I wonder if you could summarize objectively the concerns raised by people who are opposed to the ordinance that you have been in discussion with. I assume you haven't just listened to all the same voices. What are the arguments against it?
I think that most of the arguments against it are out of a fear that our single family neighborhoods are going to somewhat change in nature, that they're going to be overrun with parking problems, overrun with non-occupant landowners. And I think the first thing that I would try to allay of concerns is that the second point that you see on the screen here is that this is just a way and a mechanism to actually provide additional stability in our neighborhoods, because we're encouraging owner occupancy within existing residential neighborhoods. Many of these neighborhoods are aging, and we are dealing with the situation of home values that are frankly unattainable for a lot of home buyers. And this provides a way for people that might not be able to afford a home in some of these neighborhoods to actually have a supplemental income that provides a way for them to pay the mortgage and then allows them to stay a part of that neighborhood for an extended period of time as their family situation might change, or as family needs arise, or things like that, that they have that supplemental income that allows them to be a part of that neighborhood. I think that's one of the concerns that I hear over and over, is that it's going to change our neighborhood to the point where it's just rentals. And the reality is I think that it actually provides stability for home ownership. And so that's the first thing that I would say. The second one is parking, of course. We want to make sure that this is not an impact that is felt universally by neighborhoods, that we want to be able to say this is still a single family neighborhood. And that's why our parking minimums have not changed and likely would not. And then the other thing is that we want to make sure that people have a way to come into compliance with the law. This council and many before it have said over and over that it is not good policy to have an ordinance that people just automatically disregard. And in the situation of accessory dwelling units, this is becoming such a popular thing that we know that they're growing. We know that they're becoming a way, and frankly, one of the only ways that people can succeed in home ownership. And we want to make sure that people have a way to comply with the zoning code that we have. And this enables that.
Okay, well, Robert, I appreciate that. I mean, I think we're all pretty much aware of all the positive things that could come from this. My concern, and it goes back to my first question, is the potential negatives can only be allayed and sold to the public if we convince them that there will be enforcement. Mm-hmm. Not a laid back wait for complaints to come in, and not a situation where we're viewed as encouraging neighborhood snitching and creating divisiveness in a neighborhood. I think we've got to convince the public that we're serious about compliance. Otherwise, this is just kind of a laissez-faire amnesty approach to existing violators. And I think that was what was behind the council's commitments to renewed additional FTEs for the department that will be enforcing our zoning laws. So you need to help us and help the public be convinced that there will be enforcement to allay their fears on parking and traffic and absentee landlords.
That's a really good point. And I did want to mention that our department has grown from that additional FTE that we were able to hire. That has occurred now. And that does increase our capacity. I think that's one of the reasons that our zoning administrator felt confident in the ability to enforce this, that we do have additional resources, and we will be getting additional resources in January when the additional funds become available. which is likely when some of these additional ordinances will become coming into an effect in whatever form the council chooses. So yes, I understand that there's going to be a lot of reliance on code compliance for people to do that on their own, or for relying on situations where we can't cover the entire city every day, 24 hours a day. But I do want to express appreciation and express acknowledgement that I think that the additional capacity that the city has given, that the council has given us, makes us more confident in the ability to enforce these.
We have two counselors waiting to comment, but I see Mr. Jones probably has a clarifying comment here for us.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to follow up on Councilor Fillmore's question, and I think Robert answered it very well, although I would just add this one additional comment, which is that, I mean, parking is one thing because that's something that code enforcement administrators can see as they travel around the city. To the degree that you're talking about enforcing that a house that has an ADU in it is owner occupied, or that ADUs are not being occupied in areas of the city where they aren't allowed. My perspective on that is that the additional staff that Robert was just talking about certainly helps processing the complaints so that the complaints get enforced. The city will pretty much be completely dependent on neighborhood complaints to become aware of those situations, because there's not really any other way to become aware of them.
Thank you. Councilor Harding.
Thank you. I should say that the council has, for years and years and years before my time, has been very interested, very concerned with zoning enforcement, zoning compliance, my time on the council is coming to an end, but hopefully, the council will continue to work closely with CNS to make it as easy as possible to enforce. And we've had lots of good conversations about what legislative tools can we give you. One aspect of that, and it was more towards the short-term rentals, which we really haven't taken any legislative action on, but we did respond to their request for some software that basically monitors the standard places where people list rentals, particularly short-term rentals, and can kind of notify or can give that information to enforcement officials. State law says we can't prosecute based solely on their advertisement of their property as a short-term rental, but we can we can use that information to go out and do an investigation and to find out. And as part of that discussion, one of the things we asked is, can this be used for regular rentals, not just short-term rentals? And if I recall correctly from a couple of years ago, the answer was yes, that it could be done. And so, a quick printout of here's all of the places that have advertised for rentals in the past year, and here's a list of every property that has an RDL. Seems like pretty quickly we would know which properties we may want to check on. So I think in addition to the community complaints, I do think there may be some ways to proactively go out and enforce. And it has been something we've worked on a lot. I hope we can continue to do so and work with CNS and support them legislatively however we can. Some of these tools are just coming into place. We've hired, it sounds like we've hired some more people already. And there's also been some additional changes. And I have to say it's still fairly early, but every indication that I've seen is that zoning is being enforced more efficiently, and I have more confidence in the city's ability and in what they're doing now to enforce. And so I'm very encouraged by that. And I want to just thank CNS for what they are implementing now, and just kind of signal my full support for the efforts that they are making, and wish them best as they continue to improve the way that they enforce.
Councillor Ellsworth.
Is Robert done with his presentation? I don't want to keep commenting in the middle of it if he has 4 more slides or something.
Well, I do have a couple more things that we need to get to, but if you have specific questions, that's fine.
I don't have a question. I'll wait till the end. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Fillmore?
Yes, I do have one more question, Robert. I haven't studied the ordinance. What distinction does it make between long-term and short-term occupancy?
Long-term rentals are anything over 30 days.
Okay, so ADUs could only be used for 30 days plus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mr. Hoban.
Well, do we want Robert to finish?
Oh, I thought you had a question.
Well, I
It's
have lots of questions and comments, but I guess, so for me, a lot of this hinges on enforcement, because I think the reality is, I mean, we're sitting here saying, well, let's find a way for people to come to compliance. Like, people are out of compliance. They're not obeying the law right now. They're not going to obey it when we open this up citywide. They just aren't, unless there's enforcement. So I don't think the reality is that by doing this, that all of a sudden anybody who doesn't want this to be owner occupied is going to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to make sure I'm owner occupied. Or anybody who wants an ADU or who wants an investment property is just, if they're not worried about it now, they're not going to worry about it later, right? I mean, and now we've escalated or scaled the issue to citywide instead of just certain areas. And so I'm all about more ADUs. I have friends who have been impacted, who've had to sell their home because of enforcement, or move out and move back in with their parents because they couldn't live in the top and rent the bottom or whatever. So I am all about more ADUs, but if these don't end up being owner occupied, we haven't really done a whole lot to help the people of Provo, because outside investors from out of state or out of country are going to gobble these up and use them as top and bottom rentals, non-owner occupied. And who's going to enforce it? Right? We don't enforce it today. How are we going to enforce it when it's citywide? Like, I mean, I know we try to enforce it based on complaint stuff, but the reality is, if these don't end up owner occupied, all we've done is hand over a bunch of investment properties to people with cash who are going to beat out local buyers. And we're not going to help the people of Provo to own homes and have more affordable homes that they can own. That's my big concern. The other piece is, I bet if we asked what the top complaints were in Provo for zoning to deal with, it was probably over occupancy, noise, parking, and blight, something like that, right? Those are probably the top 4. This is not going to make that any better, especially, it's not going to make it any better if there's no enforcement, right? We're just going to have more of those complaints. And so, I don't know, I'm just looking down the road here saying, shoot, open Provo up all over. We don't have enforcement. By default, we're just turning all these potential homes into investment properties. If we don't enforce today, we're not going to enforce when there's, let's see, we go from 20% to 74%, and that's a 250% increase. We just increased our enforcement challenge by 250%. So let's open up more ADUs. To use a business term, let's nail it before we scale it. So let's do this incrementally would be my recommendation. And I know nobody wants to pick winners and losers. Nobody wants to pick, what neighborhoods are we going to open it up to? I don't know. We're not picking winners and losers. We're just picking where it goes first. And then we can nail it before we scale it, right? We can make sure we have enough enforcement. We can see how it impacts things like, how is this going to impact low-income neighborhoods? And then how does that impact rental rates or home ownership? If a bunch of investment people with cash come and buy these homes, now all of a sudden homes cost a lot more. So I would say, let's open this up incrementally, do the research. I know some of us on the council are really big on data. Let's see how it impacts neighborhoods. Let's see how it impacts schools. Let's see how it impacts enforcement. And then continue to scale it, right? As we've like figured out the impact. What percentage of homes that we open this up to end up with ADUs? Maybe it's very little. Maybe it's a lot. We just don't know. So I'm not against ADUs. I'm just against doing it wrong. So I'd say, let's take our time and do it right. We talk about smart growth. A 250% increase overnight is not smart growth, probably. So, thanks.
We have, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I know this is going to be a hot topic for discussion for a while, probably. I'm just trying to figure out how to proceed here. Councilors, can we go ahead and let Mr. Mills finish his presentation, and then we'll have a few more minutes for discussion after that. Would that be all right?
Actually, Mr. Hoban's comments were a great segue into what I really wanted to talk about next. And that is, what do you want to do? Essentially, what do you want to do, and what is going to make you as a council feel comfortable in this? We've gone from the most permissive way to do this, and now we need your feedback to say, what are you really comfortable with? And we've provided our recommendation, we provided our staff analysis and things like that, and the housing committee has some questions and has provided something. But ultimately, as decision makers, we need your input to say, what are you going to feel comfortable? What is that incremental step that is going to kind of start this process to get us into compliance? And then where do we go from there?
Well, if you're ready for feedback, I think we probably have plenty of it coming.
Ready.
Okay. I think Councilor Ellsworth was next.
Yeah, I just want to respond to some of the concerns of the counselors. I think Mr. Fillmore and Mr. Hoban are right to an extent about enforcement, but enforcement is the responsibility of the mayor and the administration. So if we trust the mayor and we trust the administration to appropriately and responsibly enforce, then we should be okay to move forward. If they come to us and say, hey, there's some issues, then we should be able to address that with both branches of government. But ultimately, enforcement is up to the administration. And we have the tools, I think, to properly enforce, appropriately and responsibly enforce. Another concern that came up was, doing it incrementally. We have done it incrementally. There's been so many variations of ADUs that in some places this is allowed, some places that's allowed. And there's still some illegal ADUs. And I don't know that we're going to completely eliminate that. But like John said, this is going to naturally occur incrementally. People who aren't in compliance will come into compliance. Our fees are not onerous. So if people want to come into compliance, they can. There's other cities where their fees are over $1,000 annually to have an ADU, and Provo's not going to do that. I don't think we're going to do that. So it will be fairly straightforward. Assuming you meet certain parking and health and safety standards, then you could get an ADU approved. And what that does is it allows us to have a better record of which homes have ADUs, owner-occupied ADUs. So I think, as John said, this will occur incrementally. Everyone's not going to rush in on day one. If they wanted to get ADUs, they could have come in today. They could have come in last week. They could have come in 2 weeks ago to get an ADU, and that hasn't occurred. There hasn't been a run on the bank. So I think that this will occur incrementally, and we will have the opportunity to tweak this as we go along. I think just a really high level, to me, I like this because it streamlines our code. It simplifies it. And the more complex our code and the more tiny little niches and parcels allow and disallow something, the harder it is for citizens to comply and the harder it is for staff to enforce. And just to be, make this a more urgent conversation, we need to comply with state law. So we need to pass an ADU ordinance very, very soon. And so if there's these conversations that need to be had, you know, obviously we're out of time here, but you can call Mr. Harding and I to talk through some of these, or Mr. Mills.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you. I did want to respond a little bit to Councillor Hoban, and let me echo. I think what pretty much everyone has been saying is enforcement is going to be key. There's no question. Enforcement is going to be key. I think we have put the pieces in place that have given the mayor and given CNS the tools that they need to properly enforce, and I think we've seen the fruits of that already, and that has been very encouraging. Right now, we talked about, you know, well, it's you know, it's in 20% and we're moving up to 70 whatever percent. Well, you can be illegal anywhere in the city. You know, you can have an illegal ADU in 100% of the city. So, and a lot of the illegal ADUs are happening outside of where they're allowed now. So, just because we open it up doesn't mean that we will have more illegal apartments necessarily, more illegal ADUs necessarily. I would actually argue that we would have less. I also believe HB 82 allows for us to require registration when people you know, get their building permit to put in an ADU or whatever. That we can require that to be registered with the county, and so I don't think. And what we've seen in the past is generally it's a current homeowner will put in an ADU and then start using it. It's not like people, not what has happened historically is that people haven't gone in and built ADUs to then turn around and sell it. It's mostly you know, the owner immediately, and so you know, we'll know where these are, and yeah. I do want to go back to what the state statute says, which is, you know, the state law says that this is now a permitted use anywhere in a single family detached house in a predominantly residential zone. So that's what it is. And then we are allowed, because we're a university city, we're allowed to exempt up to 67% of it. So, you know, that's how it's approached, and the housing committee made a recommendation. Our recommendation is to apply this citywide, and then we're open to questions, or open to proposals, open to people that want to say, well, this is an area that should be exempted, and then if we find that there's, you know, reasons to exempt it, then the council would exempt it. But the default should be citywide. So that is a committee recommendation. There were two issues that the committee was split on, and I like how Robert suggested, you know, that what's in there now is what is the most permissive, but that's not because it's the council, or sorry, the committee recommendation. The other two issues are, should we allow 3, or an occupancy of 3 or of 2. And I just want to say that right now, every single family detached home in Provo allows for a household plus two roomers and boarders. So that's already allowed everywhere. And what this would do is then if they create an accessory dwelling unit, then those 2 would then have a kind of a separate unit to live in, but it doesn't actually change what the maximum occupancy is in any of these homes. It too is already current. And so I think that's something to remember. Also, that the state has a law that we cannot implement, or we can't pass. Marcus, you can help, or Mr. Draper, you can help me with this if I'm saying this too badly. But we can't create a new occupancy limit less than 3. But it doesn't say anything about we can't enforce a current one at 2. So right now, I think we have this window of opportunity that we can keep our ADUs at 2. But if we go to 3, then we can't come back to it unless the state law changes. So I really think that our incremental step should be, let's leave it at 2 for now, and then have a discussion later if we want to move it to 3. To me, that makes sense for the incremental. And then finally, I think the internal connection, and I'm going to stop here because of the time. But I think the internal connection is critical for ADUs to function as ADUs and not as duplexes. And I think the sponsors of the bill agree with that. And I don't think there's any downside to continuing our existing requirement for internal connection. Worst case scenario, it could be deemed unenforceable until the state updates their clarification, which both sponsors have told me that they would do this coming legislative session. So I think it's better just to leave that in, and then worst case scenario, we can't enforce it for a couple of months, but it's ready to go as soon as the state allows it. But from their opinion, it's actually allowed by the state. So for those reasons, I think we should do citywide. I think we should leave it at 2 and continue to require the internal connections.
Thank you. So I see a couple of options forward here. We still haven't heard first comments from a number of counselors. If somebody wanted to make a motion, we could vote on that, or I feel like this is a huge topic that's probably going to need a lot of discussion. We could just say, let's bring it back next time and allow an hour to continue this discussion. Does anyone feel like we're ready for a motion and want to make one? Or if not, I would suggest that we bring this back and continue this discussion.
I think that's prudent.
Bring it
To bring
back.
it back.
Okay. Councillor Ellsworth, your hand's up.
Yeah, I would just say that there is some urgency to doing this, and I am supportive if the council wants to continue it. Maybe there needs to be a special meeting to discuss this with the Planning Commission. Because there is a lot of context here, and because there are a couple of decision points that might be worthwhile, is getting together with the Planning Commission. I don't know if we've met with them this year, so I generally think that's worthwhile, but I think they could provide some additional insight, and then it could move forward, hopefully faster based on that collaboration and additional time.
Thank you. And this is in a section in our code where the Planning Commission will need to weigh in regardless, correct? Okay, thank you. Anyone else have an opinion as to whether we bring it back or?
Can I just make a quick request?
Yes.
I think I appreciate the continuing comment. Is there specific information that you'd like to know?
Any specific? I do have one question. Constituent actually asked this, pointed out that, so by acreage, we have 20% of the city that allows ADUs. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe that ADUs are allowed everywhere else if an owner is 65 or older. Is that correct?
Yeah, I had a wonderful conversation with Mr. Wright yesterday about that. And that is true, that if you are 65 or older, you can have a caretaker dwelling and an ADU that way. We need to have further discussion on that if that actually meets the intent of the code, because if that 65-year-old person sells their home, then that has to go away. So whether that's actually meeting the percentage or not, we're not sure, but that's an important consideration that we need to have a discussion about.
Thank you. Mr. Strachan.
To the suggestion that we meet with the Planning Commission before you make a decision, I was under the impression from previous comments that our city attorney had made to us that probably not good to sit down with them and have a discussion about something that's pending. Let each party deliberate and make its own choices and recommendations is what I've understood. So I just caution against that.
Thank you.
I mean, it just, I suppose, depends on the purpose of the meeting. If you want to have a joint meeting so that CNS can come in and make a presentation about data so that both of you can hear the data at one time, because that's more efficient. I don't necessarily have a problem, there's no issue with that. But because the concern we've had in the past is that Planning Commission is an independent advisory body. So we want to avoid a situation where it looks like the council is saying, well, here's what we want, give us this, or vice versa. The influence question is the issue. And so to the degree that you're getting together and discussing factual matters or even a presentation on different policy considerations. I think where it gets tricky is if it then turns into a joint discussion of about what the right answer is.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Hoban.
Yeah, I had asked staff to see a zone, a radius from BYU that would get us to the 33%. I don't believe we saw that yet. Do we have that ready?
Yeah, got that one back.
Okay, yeah, I'd asked for that to see that, but if I could get that, that'd be great, because I think that'll give us an idea of if we wanted to do this fairly or, whatever, and not pick winners and losers, that might be an easy way to do it. And I know that BYU expanding changes everything. But I do think that in general, that puts the most rental pressure on our city, I would assume. So might be a way to kind of kill two birds with one stone with BYU expanding their kind of boundaries. But that would be something I think to look at. So yes, for specific questions, I think that'd be a good question. And then I do need to some clarity. So according to our current law right now, 3 unrelated parties can live in a single family residence. And then if there is an ADU, 2 unrelated parties can live in the ADU.
As long as it's owner occupied.
As long as, right, owner occupied. So hypothetically, a basement apartment. So 3 unrelated parties could be upstairs and 2 unrelated parties could be downstairs.
No, because the family has to be upstairs or downstairs.
Right, but a family can be 2 unrelated parties who are lifelong partners living together, right? It's my understanding a single family residence is 3 unrelated parties and their dependents, children, immediate dependents.
Right. So you can have I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question correctly,
So,
Travis.
So how, I want some clarity on what Mr. Harding said about how many people could be living, potentially living in the home. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Okay, so under current codes for just a regular single family residence, you can have 1 family, 1 individual, or 3 related or unrelated individuals living together.
Okay.
So when I say family, I mean like a head of household and there are people who have a certain relationship with that person.
Close, yeah.
And then they can have 2 additional related or unrelated individuals that don't meet the definition of family. So like say they're a cousin, they wouldn't meet the definition of family. So it could be a related individual or it could be just a random.
But they have to share a kitchen and there can't be a door between the basement and
there could only be 1 kitchen under the current code. They'd have to live as 1 household, 1 unit. And so the big difference between allowing an accessory dwelling unit and not is that now you can have essentially a separate unit within the home.
So how many people hypothetically in a basement apartment could be living unrelated upstairs and unrelated downstairs, hypothetically?
So upstairs, again, up to 3 unrelated individuals is within the definition of family. So when you have an accessory dwelling unit, you don't get the 2 borders like you would with just a regular single family residence. So in the downstairs basement unit, for example, if that were an accessory dwelling unit, then you could have 2 related or unrelated individuals plus their minor children.
Right. So what I said initially, 3 unrelated upstairs and 2 unrelated
that would be
downstairs.
permissible.
Hypothetically, most case scenario.
Yeah,
We'll call it worst case scenario.
I mean, most case scenario is you have somebody with 10 minor children, 12 minor children. I mean,
That's the best case scenario.
You could have a certainly a very big family that would exceed those numbers.
Right. All right. I think that just helps me visualize what we might be talking about as far as maximum occupancy from adult drivers with cars and noise complaints or, whatever. I mean,
And so, I mean, important thing to understand with cars is that in our code, it already requires and is allowed by HB 82 that for every car at the residence, there has to be off-street parking. So, I mean, one way as a roundabout way of answering Councilor Fillmore's questions or concerns is that parking seems to be a primary way in which these complaints come in. There's people parking on the street, and so we get complaints and we investigate and we determine that there's a violation. So if that would be, I think, certainly a continued issue when we're doing enforcement, that if people are parking off street.
Thanks for clarifying. Appreciate it.
And that's why Marcus is on my right side.
Any other questions that you, well, first of all, It seems like we're heading toward bringing this back unless one of these hands that I see up is for, to make a motion. Counselor Ellsworth or Counselor Harding, did you have a motion you wanted to make?
I'm not going to make a motion because it sounds like the council's not ready for that. But I just want to express the expediency that we need to be exercising. This should have been done in September. And I think we only have 3 council meetings left this year. Is that right?
We have 4 more after tonight.
Oh, 4 more. Okay. Yeah, so there's very few left, and the planning commission probably has just as many. And so we need to get through those processes as well. So please reach out to Dave Harding and I on the housing committee. Please, we want to talk through this.
Thank you. All right. Mr. Hoban, okay.
So I guess if we need to be expedient about this, I'm going to make a motion, and my motion would be that we look at a radius from the center of BYU campus that would get us to 33% that we could approve as a initial step in this process, and then continue this conversation of how we get to 50% and 74% if that's overnight or if it's not. But we have to get compliant right away. So I guess that's my motion.
Thank you. We have a motion by Mr. Hoban. Is there a second? I'll second that for purposes of discussion. I don't know if that's the best answer, but I do agree with Mr. Hoban's approach. Nail it, then scale it, and let's do this incrementally. Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, I've had reservations about the arbitrary nature of that 33% ever since I first heard that number. I don't like it that we would sort of randomly. I mean, I still think we're picking winners or losers, even if we draw a circle. It doesn't seem to prevent that problem. And so I've always said that if we're going to increase it, we've got to have some, rational grounds for that increase. Otherwise, I think we're actually doing more harm than good. And I think actually we're creating more confusion in the code that will then make enforcement a harder problem. I do agree that the simpler the code, the simpler the issue. And I think I am persuaded, although I feel some caution about this, that if there is this significant increase in supply, that maybe we decrease the pressure that leads to violations and trouble. I don't think we're going to have no trouble at all. I think we're going to have to be very vigilant. And I think I've heard that from several people. So I'm not at all inclined to do something that just meets the 33% when I can't justify with a straight face why one neighborhood is included and another one's excluded. I just think that's going to create more problems than I'm willing to deal with at this point. That said, I am very sympathetic to the need to be expedient here, but I don't think that's the right solution.
I think Mr. Jones has a clarifying comment, probably.
Well, it's probably a question for Robert Mills from the previous discussion. And it probably makes it worse by giving you more options. But my understanding is from previous discussion that the other option you have to come into immediate compliance incrementally and then discuss further down the road is that if you immediately pass an ordinance making ADUs permissible in all residential zones except for R1, that would meet the threshold. And then you could talk about R1s later. Is that right, Robert?
Yeah, so I think that if we allowed, and for some reason my slides aren't going backwards. So Malia, could you go back a couple slides? There we go. So if you did everything, if you allowed, say all R18 zones, then you would meet that requirement. You'd actually have 37%. If you only did R16, R17, you would not meet that requirement. So basically, if you excluded R110 and above, you would be compliant with the state code. So
Right, yeah,
I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I said R1, but I meant R110. Anyway, I just wanted to, because I didn't hear that explicitly said today, I just wanted to bring that up since there is some discussion about a short-term incremental response. You do have that option. I'm not advocating for it. I just want to make sure that that's clear.
Mr. Strachan, did you have some clarifying comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it sounds to me like there's an issue. The issue before council is whether or not you want to scale it, however the method, or go to the citywide. And I think that's really the first decision point you have on that question. I suspect from comments I've heard that you've got at least 4 that would prefer the citywide approach, but that's kind of where you're at. Also, if you're talking about the number, it sounds like if you were divided up, if you took all the R10s instead of the R16, 17, 18, you'd still get a number, I believe, that would get you above the 33% threshold.
And that was
if that was your choice. But really, at some point, you just got to decide: are you going to scale up, or are you going to go citywide? Is what I keep hearing in the discussions.
Sure. So can I piggyback on that? Sorry to interrupt. But
Yes, go ahead.
it just occurred to me that given our long time discussions that we've had about how if you get a planning commission recommendation, then you can do something completely different than the planning commission recommendation as long as it's less permissive than what they reviewed. If Director Strachan is correct about what he just said, one option here is to send all R1 zones to the planning commission, let them review it, let them give you feedback on it, come and then bring it back to the council for a vote. And if after you have planning commission feedback and all of the information that you've gathered in the meantime, you think that's not the right approach, you can do something more restrictive without sending it back to them. That seems like the most efficient thing to me.
Could you clarify that for me, Mr. Jones?
Well, so what I'm saying is if you let the proposal, Mr. Mills has said several times during the presentation that the presentation you have in front of you is the most permissive option on the table. So if you send that to planning commission and you let them review it, they might come back to you with a recommendation that you do that, or they might come back to you with a recommendation that you do something more restrictive. Once you have that recommendation, you can do anything up to what they've reviewed or more restrictive than what they've reviewed. So if they've reviewed all R1 zones and then it comes back to you and they say, even if they say we recommend approval, or if they say we recommend denial and here's our alternative proposal, you can then at that point take any action that is up to what they've reviewed.
Understood. Thank you. And Mr. Shipley, we haven't had a first comment from you yet, so go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Some of my thoughts have been expressed by other counselors, and I appreciate their comments. Is it appropriate at this point? I mean, would I be able to make a substitute motion to the effect of what Mr. Jones just barely said, which is I would propose or move that we, as a substitute motion, that we submit this to the Planning Commission as, the full citywide, and allow them to review and then bring it back to us.
So we have a substitute motion from Mr. Shipley.
I'll second it.
And a second by, who was that?
Councilor Harding.
Councilor Harding. Second by Councilor Harding. And could you clarify, Mr. Jones, for me at least? So we have a recommendation from the Housing Committee. And if we vote on this, if this motion passes by the council, then what are we sort of like giving the Planning Commission a starting point, or what's our role at this point?
That may require a little bit of clarification. I'm not sure exactly what Councilor Shipley had in mind. He mentioned specifically just that we open up ADUs citywide. I'm not sure whether that was the only point that he wanted sent to them, or if his motion was to send the Housing Committee's recommendation to the Planning Commission.
Mr. Shipley, could you clarify?
Yeah, my thought was to send the recommendation to the commission assuming that it's the most permissive, on all those fronts, and then have them review and come back and then continue the discussion based on, with their feedback on whether or not we make it more restrictive or not.
Okay, so we have a substitute motion by Mr. Shipley and a second. Is discussion on the motion.
Chair, can I jump in really quick?
Mr. Mills.
So essentially that enables us to make a text amendment application because we don't have one yet. We're just wanting to get the council's feedback on what that text amendment should be. If the council goes forward and says, yes, we want to send this, staff will prepare a text amendment application, get that on the agenda for Planning Commission on October 27th. And that way it will come back to you in November.
Got it. All right. Mr. Harding.
Thank you. And I seconded it. I support it. I appreciated the clarification because the committee recommendation is mixed on that 3 or 2 and that internal connection. So I appreciate that he said the most permissive, and I can support that. I'm not thrilled by it because I think to me, we really should keep it at 2 and require that internal connection just for a lot of reasons. And I'd hate for the Planning Commission to spend too much time looking at that. But, if we already know that the council generally supports not going to 3 and not dropping our internal connection. So I kind of prefer to, if we could, vote on that or indicate our support so we know what we're submitting to them. But in addition to that, I also, whether it needs to be part of a recommendation or just an understanding, but I think we also need to go forward and draft language about the $100 fine, the liens, and also the registry when ADUs are created. I think those are aspects that I'd love to see get done at the same time. And so I think we should start working on those.
Thank you, Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I appreciate Mr. Shipley's motion. And I think that if his intent is in the most permissive ordinance possible to be submitted to the Planning Commission, then that would include 3 people permitted, 3 unrelated people permitted in the accessory dwelling unit. And that's what I'm in favor of. It is near impossible for code enforcement to determine how many people live in a unit. And so it just doesn't make sense for one house to have 2 people permitted in the basement and the next house to have 3 people permitted in the basement. I think it's just confusing generally. So the more streamlined, the more straightforward, the more simple it is, the easier it is for citizens to comply and code enforcement to enforce. And unfortunately, the previous motion would actually set the housing committee back. It doesn't really answer, it gives us a new assignment and doesn't answer these questions that need to be addressed, whether it's 2 or 3 in the basement or whether we keep the ANS overlay. And so I would not be in favor of the previous motion.
Mr. Fillmore.
Thank you. I feel like we're rushing this. There are a lot of unanswered questions. It's a very complex issue. It's going to have massive repercussions for the city. I really feel like it merits more discussion at this level with the council in 2 weeks. I understand there's some urgency to come into compliance with the state law. I would like to think we could still pull that off if we can have more discussion between each other in the ensuing 2 weeks and with department people to try to clarify our thinking on things. I think that would be helpful rather than just punting it to the Planning Commission without any additional guidance. It's my feelings. I understand the motivation, and I think that's admirable. But I can't support that motion. I just think it merits more internal discussion.
Mr. Henley.
Yeah, I'll just say about this motion, I support it. I think if we would have a solid month, it sounds like, to continue our conversations. So maybe in the interest of even expediting our own processing of this complicated problem, I don't know if it's appropriate to have a work session where we do some more, discussion and deliberation, even while we're waiting for the planning commission to offer their input. But I feel that maybe I'm trying to balance Mr. Fillmore's concerns with the concerns about expediency by suggesting ways in which we can and will continue the conversation, but also allow this process to go forward to get some feedback. I'm quite comfortable with the idea that we can still do whatever we want once we get that feedback from the planning commission, and we're not making them make the decision for us. We're still going to make the decision. So I'm very comfortable supporting this motion.
Mr. Strachan?
If we needed a work session between now and October 27th, how would that affect your language application to the planning commission? Could we meet next week and discuss stuff before that meeting?
Absolutely. We'll submit as is. I mean, if that's the direction that we're given, we'll submit we'll fix the language, submit it as is, but we can let the planning commission know that these are the suggested changes. This is what we're actually going to consider now. That's not a problem.
If there's no further, Mr. Hoban.
I guess I just share my opinion on the 2 or 3 and the internal connection. So I hadn't thought about that until Councilor Harding brought that up just prior to the meeting. But I guess my initial gut reaction is 2 or 3. 3 is okay. And I don't necessarily need, in my mind, there doesn't need to be an internal connection. I can't see how typically there wouldn't be. But even if there weren't, I guess I'm okay with that. For me, it's more so around the process of how we're rolling this out and the implications that we don't know about yet. So I don't want to I'm not concerned about those details. Just if you need to get a pulse for where we're at on that.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other comments? And we'll vote on the substitute motion. Do we want to restate that? Just to make sure we're clear on which one we're voting on.
Okay, so Mr. Shipley moved that the council submit the housing commission or the housing committee's recommendation to the planning commission with the most permissive version of the ordinance, and then to bring that back to the council for further discussion.
Thank you. That was my understanding as well. All in favor? Mr. Hanley is a yes. Mr. Fillmore?
It's a no.
Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Harding?
Yes.
Councillor Ellsworth?
Yes.
Councillor Hoban?
I guess it doesn't hurt to keep the conversation and peace moving forward, given the urgency.
Was that a yes?
That's a yes. That's a yes. I'm sorry. I figured you could read my mind.
Dramatic pause.
And I'll vote no as well. So the motion carries 5-2 with Councillors Fillmore and Sewell opposed.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We actually got through a motion on that. Now we're overdue for a break. Let's try to make this as short as possible since we're more than a half hour behind schedule. So we'll be back hopefully within 5 minutes or as quickly as you can. Welcome back. We'll move on to item number 4, which is a discussion on towing fees. And Mr. Strachan will present this. And given that this is not particularly time sensitive, let's try to be as quick as we can and try to get through it quickly.
That's my goal. We had 20 minutes. If we can do it in 5, I'm perfectly happy.
Yeah.
So council members, just a rehash. We had a towing company manager who requested that the council consider changes in the rates since they hadn't been raised since 2014. So where they apply to is non-consent towing fees. Those are the ones that where also known as predatory towing, when towing company goes and finds a car in violation, picks it up, et cetera. So this is the code that's referenced. Currently, the state allows for booting, which is immobilizing the vehicle, $75 for the first 24-hour period. Towing itself is $168 for towing, $35 for the admin, and 40 days for the first $40 for storage, which is, I think, is $243. Currently, our limitations from January 31st of 2014 is when they kicked in. Booting is $60 or about 80% of what the $75 charge, and our towing vehicle is $175, which initially started out as about 82% of what the towing vehicle costs back in 2014. 2021, that has slipped for towing to 72% of what the current state rates are. And what I'm in discussion with different people on council, what's being proposed is to set the city rate as a percentage of the state rate for any non-consent towing fees. And if we set those at $80, the booting fee stays at $60, but the towing fee, admin fee, and storage as a first day fee goes up to almost $195. From the 68 that it is 175 that it is now. So it goes up a little bit, recognizing some of the costs. The current code that we have only addresses the first 24-hour period, doesn't address the longer term if somebody either can't get back to their vehicle or pick it up from the tow yard, the state law numbers kick in. So the suggested motion is, if you're satisfied with this, the suggested motion is to direct staff to prepare for council's consideration amendments to the Provo City Code, setting the maximum authorized rate for non-consent towing and related fees at 80% of the state cap. If you wanted to amend that slightly and apply the 80% to everything that relates to the 24 beyond the first 24 hours, you could do that as well. But based on what we've talked about, and I know we had this conversation about leadership, but Brian and I were talking about this, and it's our understanding that you were intending to fix that first 24-hour period and not adjust it beyond that. That's all I had for you. Any questions?
Any questions for Mr. Strachan? And if I might just jump in quickly, our leadership intent in proposing this, mainly just a question of fairness for the business. We think this follows the intent of the hard work that Mayor Curtis's team did to keep rates lower in Provo, but if there isn't some kind of inflation adjustment by tying it to the state fee, then essentially we feel like we're sort of regulating this type of business out of business over a long period of time by not allowing them to have any way to adjust for their increasing expenses. So basically what we're just looking for is if there's support for this general concept, then we'd bring it back as just described by Mr. Strachan. Any questions? Anyone inclined to make a motion? Mr. Shipley.
So I personally am in support of us tying some kind of percentage to the rate. Having said that, in our last meeting, it was mentioned that there are most cities, just do whatever the state, they do the state's requirement or the state amount. But that there were at least one or two cities, if I recall correctly, that don't allow any kind of non-consent towing. And I didn't even know that was something available. And so that's been bouncing around in my head ever since that was mentioned. And it makes me a little bit conflicted on, a direction for this. So in principle, I want us to have some kind of inflation adjustment for business owners if they're doing this. And I don't want us to get so detached from state law that at some point it becomes a legal battle to try to override what we've done here to make it a little bit less. But at the same token, like I say, there are places that aren't doing any of this. And so I guess I just need to process that and figure out for myself if this is if there's reason to think that maybe we shouldn't be at all allowing this. I don't know. I just need more information, I guess, after hearing that.
Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, I just want a real quick clarification on that. I think, so what we're talking about is patrol towing. So I don't think there's any cities. So the terminology in the state code is very confusing, but there are non-consent police generated tows, which is where the police call the tow company. Those are allowed everywhere. Then there's non-consent, non-police generated tows, which, and even those are divided into two categories, at least in our ordinance, which are non-consent, non-police generated tows that are initiated personally by the property owner. Again, I think those are allowed everywhere. And then there are these, what we're talking about here are non-consent, non-police generated tows that result from the tow company patrolling the lot. And so my shorthand for those is I call those patrol towing. And that's what Councilor Shipley is. That's the only thing that these rate limitations apply to. And that's what Councilor Shipley is referring to, that we had a discussion that there are, at least we've heard that there are a couple of cities that do not allow patrol towing and require direct requests for the tows by the property owner or manager.
Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I'm curious if do we understand the process that the state took to reach their?
They've delegated, the state legislature has delegated the rate making authority to the Department of Transportation, the Department of Motor Vehicles. They have a specific, I don't remember now exactly what the division is called, but there's a specific division that addresses towing issues. And they go through a process every year where they adjust those rates. I believe that the storage rate has stayed fixed, but they have from time to time, or pretty much every year, they raise the towing fees a little bit, generally to, I think the idea, at least is because of increased costs for gas, maintenance, employees, things like that.
Mr. Strachan.
One of the reasons I think former Mayor Curtis had addressed this back in 2013, 2014 was that because of the size of the number of students that we have in the city, the student areas of the city formed a pretty target-rich environment, and that's where we were getting a lot of our complaints and concerns about predatory towing, and I think that was the effort to address it. That may also be why so many other cities don't worry about it and keep it at the state rate. They're not dealing with the same population dynamics as we are.
Thank you. In the interest of time, since we do have a lot more to cover, all we're really trying to determine here is if there's a majority interested in considering an inflation adjustment, and if there's not, then we won't bring this back. So I'd like to make a motion along the lines of what's suggested here to direct staff to prepare for the council's consideration an amendment that would essentially tie our rate on patrol towing to the state's rate at 80%. Is there a second on the motion?
I'll second that, Chair Sewell.
Okay, there's a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Mr. Hanley?
Yeah, I'm still concerned about those students in their pocketbooks with regard to paying these fees. So I'm not inclined to see an increase.
Okay. Mr. Shipley, did you have a comment or was that for the second?
No, I did have a quick comment. I'm supportive of this because I want to further the discussion. I need to look into, I think it was Salt Lake City that doesn't have, you can't patrol tow. And if it's popular or common in college cities or university cities to not allow patrol towing, either in Utah or other cities, I want to look into that, because I think if police can call it in, if landowners can call it in, or property managers can call it in, perhaps we're, so there's a bigger picture issue that I just need to look into a little bit more and continue. And I'm supportive of continuing the discussion. I don't know if it's right or wrong. I just want to continue to look at this, I guess.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yes, I agree with Mr. Shipley's questions. I'd like to get answers to those before we finalize anything.
Thank you. And I would agree with what Mr. Shipley said as well. From my standpoint, if we really don't want to have this type of business, I would prefer to take the approach that Salt Lake City did and just not allow it. It just seems unfair to me to set a cap on a rate and never change it. And over a period of decades, it's just a long, slow, agonizing way to drive a business bankrupt or make it so that they can't continue to operate. So I just feel like it'd be more straightforward if we don't want to have this type of business to go the other route. And if we do see it as having value in the city, then I think the minimum that we should do is have an inflation adjustment. So any other comments on the motion?
Yes, just by way of clarification, Chair, I'm not opposed to the fairness of an inflation adjustment. I just like to look at the larger issue and maybe attach that to whatever we do. The larger issue being the patrol pull, the patrolling and the predatory aspect.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? And I'll call for a vote. See, I always get confused here because I've got to look for hands here. So I'll look for hands here first. All those in favor? That's Mr. Sewell and Mr. Hoban voting in favor here. Mr. Hanley opposed. And now I'll do the roll call remotely. Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore?
I'll vote yes, given the limited nature of the motion, but I still want to look at the other issue.
Okay. Councilor Ellsworth?
Yes.
And let's see, who am I not seeing? Mr. Harding?
No.
Okay, so the votes in favor are Mr. Hoban, Mr. Sewell, Mr. Shipley, Mr. Fillmore, Councilor Ellsworth, opposed being, this is too much to remember at once, Councilor Handley and Councilor Harding. Thank you. All right, let's move on to item number 5, which is a presentation from the Parking Committee, and this is to be presented by Councilor Harding.
Thank you very much, Chair Sewell. And I'll try to streamline my presentation. As soon as we get that presentation up, I will begin. I've been making a whole bunch of these presentations over the years, and I think this council has seen several of them. So rather than starting from scratch, I'm just going to kind of jump off of a previous presentation that we made and try to move through this quickly. This work has come out of the effort to address the parking situation in Joaquin, but is even bigger than just Joaquin. This is not a parking permit program, but a better way to manage on-street parking. Hey, look at that. Rather than go through the whole process, let me just summarize a couple of points and then jump into the proposal. The background, in a nutshell, is that on-street parking is one of the greatest inventions of Western civilization. Okay, that might be a little over the top, but seriously, think about the convenience that on-street parking
Don't buy
provides.
dinner for me, period.
If you want to stop by someone's house, if you have something to drop off or something to pick up, you can just drive to the house and find an open spot on the curb, park there and run on up. If you need a plumber to come by, they can come by, they can park there on your curb and they can access that. Deliveries. If you want to have a party and you want a bunch of people to come over, you can use that space. And that event, that the flexibility to handle events is pretty important. Imagine if there's churches or schools or other places that maybe a half dozen times in a year they have bigger events. Without on-street parking, every facility would have to have a parking lot big enough to accommodate all of the parking needs, the peak parking needs of that facility. But if with on-street parking, those parking facilities can be much smaller, more what is regularly used, and then that one-time, occasional overflow can be handled in the street. And I can use that for when I have my parties, and my neighbor can use it when they have their parties, and hopefully they don't happen on the same night. But that on-street parking is a huge amenity. These conveniences break down in a couple of ways. One, if we just ban on-street parking, you don't get the benefits of on-street parking. But the other way that you lose the benefits of on-street parking is when demand exceeds the capacity of the on-street parking. More people want that. And so you want to invite your friends over to the Super Bowl party that you're throwing, and you're going to have 7 cars pull up or show up, and to find 7 open spaces near your house, you're now extending out, a 4-block radius so they can all park, and they don't know where to park. They don't know where in that 7-block radius they can find that on-street parking. So really, the committee loves on-street parking. We are huge fans of on-street parking. There are places in the city where on-street parking is breaking down. So the goals for the committee, I think we set these 3.5 years ago: reduce frustrations, improve quality of life. We want predictability for residents. And sometimes in our strange terminology, we will talk about students and residents. Students are residents. And this is absolutely designed to improve the life of all residents in the area, especially the students. We love our students. We want our students. They are a big part of who we are as a city. And we want them to choose to live south of campus. That is the best place for them to be. And particularly with the new announced change to BYU's policy, we need to make South Campus as livable, as attractive as possible to as many students as possible, so that they will want to live there. They will want to be within walking distance of the campus and reduce the parking and the traffic demands that they're going to be producing. As the amount we've talked about it, it's likely that people are going to expand out. That is going to cause more driving, more traffic congestion, and is going to produce more parking pressure. We need to address this before the coming fall. Encourage efficient use of off-street parking. And let me get into this. Some people I've heard, when talking about, well, we're going to start a parking management program, like, there's the government trying to make another big program or whatever. This is actually market-based. The curb is already a public a public, not amenity, but it's public space. And so this is not the government creating a new program to regulate private use. This is actually, we're already skewing the market for parking. And this will actually, is market based. I mean, this is free enterprise at its best. We will stop getting in the way of free enterprise with this program. Stop encouraging cars, stop discouraging redevelopment. I think we've tackled that previously, and financially self-supporting. That's a given. It has to be financially self-supporting. A year ago, we were talking about these different options. Option one is, kind of in the literature, it's the best practice. It's kind of like the ideal. Option two, I guess doesn't show it on the slide, but that was at the time what Community and Neighborhood Services was recommending. Option three was one that the committee over the years had kind of developed a preference for. We battled back and forth, between option two and option three, and finally the then director of Community and Neighborhood Services said, well, what if we just go to one? And everyone kind of looked at each other and said, we're okay with that. So we've been working on pursuing option one for about a year now. As we went out and talked to it, we have added a slight modification. So jumping into kind of the proposal that's before you, right now we currently have Chapter 980, which talks about permit parking in Provo, creates kind of the scheme of how we handle permit parking in Provo, has kind of these default parameters, and then we have a bunch of subsequent chapters where it implements various permit parking areas in the city. Interestingly, there's a chapter, North Joaquin, that's empty because it was repealed, and but we have 3 other active ones. So the proposal is based off of that. We created a parallel in some ways, Chapter 990, which creates this new scheme, this new paradigm of on-street parking management, and explains kind of the parameters. And then from that 990, it doesn't actually implement it anywhere in the city. Subsequent chapters would need to be also passed that would implement an on-street parking management area in a specific part in the city. So we're paralleling the structure that's already in place. So under 990, what is the council's responsibility? The council's responsibility is to determine if on-street parking demand outstrips on-street capacity, and if an on-street parking management area is warranted. We need to decide that, and then we need to set the broad boundaries in which the parking manager can work. And I actually skipped one thing. I wanted to talk about this option one, this kind of best practices. And this is used throughout the country. But the theory behind this is when you have a street that has more demand than capacity, the best thing to do is to charge a fee that is as low as possible that brings the demand back under the capacity. They talk about the target is at the peak time, peak parking demand time, there should still be one space available. And that should be your target. And if you have a fee in there and it's creating more than one space available even at the peak, then your fee is too high and you're not getting the full benefit of that on-street parking. Or if there's lots of time when there's no on-street parking, obviously the demand is still above. And so you need to increase the fee. It's market-based. And so, but when you do that, there's always knock-on effect. It always impacts other areas. And so you can try to estimate, okay, if we put this parking permit program here, how far is it going to push parking out of that? And it's you kind of have to guess ahead of time and then legislatively put that into these chapters. Where this approach, you draw a broad boundary and then you just allow the parking manager to make adjustments without going back through the whole legislative process. And that flexibility is key. And so if you draw a broad boundary, that's best. And then the parking manager creates parking zones within that parking area. And these parking zones, people, if they want to park there, they have to pay at least during the peak hours. And this creates a framework, and then the parking manager gets to make all of these set all these parameters to make it work for that
specific parking zone. So the timing, when it gets implemented, when it gets modified, when it gets terminated, that's up to the parking manager. What block faces are included in that parking zone, the grace period before the charging starts, times in which parking would be charged, and what rate to charge at. And can someone play? Oop, I may have messed that up. Sorry, is that me? And then there's a video there if we could play it. That right there. So this is an example, one of many that's on. Yeah, that's my bad. I apologize. I didn't set the permissions right. We'll skip it. There are a lot of apps out there. And I wish you could see this. It is amazingly slick, how it goes through the selection of the zone, which parking zone you're in. For people that are just visiting, it's easy to add a car. For those who use it regularly, it stores what car you have already. You can just kind of slide it along to select the amount of time. It's easy to see what the cost is, and if you extend longer, what is the cost going to be, and all of that. It allows for validations to be used. It remembers your payment method. It stores your payment history, so you can go back and see, kind of receipts. You can add time as you go on. Anyway, there's a lot of tools already existing out there, and I'll actually circle back on this a little bit later as well. And can I advance it? Oop. Okay. We went out, we talked to the community. This was one piece of feedback that we wanted to address. In addition to just, but I mean, understand that the default is this paid time to parking for everyone. As a slight modification, there are certain areas where the parking manager may decide to allow parking permits. It could be limited to one, possibly two, depending on kind of the philosophy, how you do this, but per property, not per unit, not per resident, but per property, you could have a limited number. And this would only really make sense for areas where there's only a few units, one or just a few units per property, mostly where the on-street parking demand is external. That there's enough for the residents to live on that street, but because other people are coming in to park, that's where that demand is coming. So it would make sense in those areas. And the permit would just allow a vehicle to be able to park there without having to pay the timed rate. The notifications that are built in, all residents and property owners in the affected area, 30 days before the council considers creating one of these areas, must be notified. And then anytime that the parking manager wants to make a change inside a parking zone, all of the people that live in that affected area and own property in that affected area have to be notified at least 2 weeks beforehand. Let me just bring it back that the goal is to improve the experience of the people who live here. The goal is not to make money. We need a great app. We need, these are things that we didn't write into we haven't figured out exactly how to or if we're going to, but right now it's not in the proposed language because we want to give that parking manager flexibility, but these are things that we really feel strongly about. The first half hour should be free. Again, this is about convenience. This is about allowing these advantages of on-street parking. We want the first violation to be a warning. Again, it's not about making money. It's about helping this to function well. And if someone's constantly violating, I mean, they're going to start paying very quickly. But the first time, I think it's easy enough to give a warning. The rates should be set by market demand as low as possible. But the point is not to make money, but it has to be self-sustaining. Enforcement should be paid by the violators. If you put this on and you don't enforce, some people will pay, some people may not, particularly if they realize that they're not likely to be enforced on. But if you have a lot of people that are non-compliant, then if you do send enforcement down there, they're going to have a lot of tickets with very little effort into it. And so, and then there's a balance somewhere in the middle where you're still making more money off of the enforcement than what it costs to do that, particularly with these apps where you know, whether someone has a permit and so they're already in the database, or they pay and then temporarily they get put into this database, or even if it's free, they still log in or whatever. And so you just drive down once, license plate reader, ding, 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 ding. If they're in the database, it drives right down. Anyone not in the database, they either get a ticket or a warning. Enforcement should for easily more than pay for itself. If it's not paying for itself, then we're way over patrolling. Paid time parking pays for the program. You know, the people, if there's not enough demand, then we shouldn't be doing it. If there's enough demand, then the people that are paying it should be more than enough to pay for the signs and the administration.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
What about the time demands that this places on staff?
What aspect?
This program, what is the staff's response been to this? Do we think this is going to be very, very time consuming for somebody? For
enforcement, or for the permits, or for you know, creating the timed?
Well, all of the above, I guess.
All of the above.
Yeah.
Staff is going to be doing an in-depth review.
Okay.
And that is still forthcoming.
Okay.
And then permits should pay for themselves, set the price, whatever it needs to be, but understanding that they could be subsidized by the people that are paying to park there on the street, because they're either their guests or it's people that live somewhere else and then that are parking there. And so it makes sense to me that, you know, as they're paying that time to parking, you know, that might make sense to offset some of the permit costs. Everything I've seen from even about a year and a half ago when we had finance kind of give us some top level numbers and whatnot, it's very likely that there's going to be an excess of revenue. And so that actually brings the question of what should be done there. And I think that's an open discussion still. But none of this actually affects the language that's being proposed. But these are just kind of guiding principles that I think should be considered, I guess, by the parking manager when it comes down to it. And that's the end of my presentation.
Mr. Fillmore, did you have a question?
Yes, I do, for Mr. Harding. This plan certainly reflects a fine engineering mind. I appreciate how you've grappled with a complex problem and come up with a rational solution and tried to consider every contingency. I guess I just have two questions for you, David. The one is, give me your worst case scenario if we do nothing. And second is, there are parties who oppose just about any kind of a parking plan. I'm thinking particularly of the large landowners, or excuse me, large rental apartment owners in the area who don't seem very excited about any kind of a parking plan. I wonder if you could just summarize objectively their objections, their concerns, and how you plan on addressing those concerns. So there's two questions for you.
Okay. Worst case scenario, if we don't do anything, the city has not been doing anything for 50 plus years that this has been an issue, and every few years it tries to be fixed. And I think this time we actually have a shot because of the technology we have now that we didn't have in the past. It is, you know, talk with any BYU student. Most students have lived south of campus at least at some point during their BYU career, and most just kind of, you know, shake their head when you talk about, well, how was parking, you know, when you live there? It is a significant negative impact to their quality of life. But it is the way that it's been for 50 years, and students still show up. They still complain about the parking, and they you know, so from that perspective, it is the status quo. It is a nightmare in to quote some people. But the world won't collapse if we don't do something about it. Other than BYU's change in their policy, that is too big for me to wrap my head around. I do not fully understand all of the ramifications because I think it is going to be a mixed bag. But I think it's fair to say that we will likely have more students living outside of that 20-minute walk radius, more students wanting to commute in. When I talked about skewing the free market, I mean, already BYU has lots for free, but they're further away, and they have lots that people can pay for that are nearer and about the same distance as parking and walking and walking into to campus. And those are mostly empty. And BYU would love it if people would use that and not park in the neighborhood. But right now we're undercutting their ability to sell permits for those lots. And so I think the worst case scenario is more people are going to live further away, more people are going to commute in, more people are going to say, I'm not going to pay $60 a semester to park in that lot if I can just park out here. And parking woes are going to get worse this upcoming fall. There are some. Oh, go ahead.
So when you refer to the nightmare, you're talking about people looking for a place to park and they can't, or at least they unwilling to use the BYU lots, but also landowners who don't want students perpetually parking in front of their homes.
There's that. There's the complaints of people not being able to put their garbage cans out on the street to have them picked up. Sometimes they'll put their cans out on the street, and I mean, this is all anecdotal, but someone will come in, want that parking spot, will move their trash cans up onto the curb, and then park there. So that's kind of the daytime commuter issue. There is also the nighttime, just people who live there, and there's an insufficient off-street parking for the people that live there. And in a committee meeting, we got some pushback from the apartment owners who were there at the time. But just 2 weeks ago, I was talking with someone, and he said that he had just the night before, he had been talking with a friend. It was about 11:30, and she was coming in from work. And she spent 20 minutes driving around looking for a place to park, finally found one after 20 minutes, and then walked multiple blocks to her apartment building. She has bought a parking pass for her apartment. Her apartment oversells permits for the number of off-street park spaces that they have. And so regularly, because she works late, regularly she has to park on the street, even though she has purchased that. So that's the kind of nightmare that is going on and has been going on in Joaquin for decades. And we have an opportunity here to bring some on-street parking management that, again, allows, for example, a business has a parking lot. But no one's going to pay to park there because they can get parking out on the street, and so sometimes they come into the parking lot, the private parking lot, and then they get booted and towed. But if there's now a monetary value for parking on the street, now that business can say, okay, I'll rent overnight parking in my lot. And now it makes sense for that business owner to open that lot up for people to park. That's the kind of market solutions that are available, but we're undercutting because we allow free parking.
Mr. Shaka.
If you've got specific questions, we have a couple of the planning staff here that are familiar with these issues. But a couple of things I think in order to try and move this along a little bit, I think the overarching question is whether you as a council are even supportive of this type of parking regulation, regardless of what is specifically in the code. And then in the view of moving forward, are you prepared to move forward with the changes to 9.90 or not? And if you are should we also be trying to pass the proposed 9.91, which is the actual program in the Joaquin area, but by the end of the year, and those have some parameters around for the staff in terms of time constraints. But in terms of moving this forward, I think those are the two essential questions. Are you supportive of this kind of program? If yes, are you prepared to move forward with 9.9? And if you're prepared with 9.9, are you prepared with 9.91?
Thank you, Mr. Strachan. Mr. Shipley?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Strachan. I was actually going to ask Mr. Harding, what is the next step? Like, what do we need to decide today? But one more quick thing to Mr. Fillmore's comment about, large apartment complex owners, being frustrated with something like this potentially. I completely understand why they would be frustrated by this. The flip side is I was visiting with a client the other day that happens to be a property owner of apartments near BYU. And he feels like the city is subsidizing these large apartment complexes that did not have enough parking, right? Didn't build enough parking. And in his own complex, he spent a lot of money, a lot more money than most complexes to build parking spaces sufficient for the people that live in his building. So his comment to me was, please do some kind of paid parking program, because the city is subsidizing these big apartment buildings, these owners that didn't build sufficient parking and are creating a lot of this problem. And of course, financially, they don't want to compensate us for that. They haven't historically. But at some point, we're providing this amenity to these apartment owners, these big apartment building owners, at no charge right now from the city's perspective. And so, and making it very unfair for apartment buildings that did have sufficient off-street parking built in. So I would just say that it's not perfect, it's anecdotal, but there's also that side of this conversation as well. And then I will just say for myself, I'm very supportive of both 9.9 and 9.91 in that I think that we need to move forward with some guidelines for a new parking coordinator or parking manager to be able to operate and to be able to move forward and have something to accomplish right away. 9.91, even if we got 9.9 done and the parking manager could help influence 9.91, I'd feel like that was a big victory and a big move in the right direction. So just something to move this along so that we at least have the potential for a parking manager and administration to come along and say, look, we've got a perfect area to put paid, put the app, try the app out, get it going. I think if you travel to other cities, you'll see parking apps all over the country. This isn't something new, or brand new that we're going to be the trial, guinea pig on. This is something that's happening all around the country already. And for high demand areas, it makes perfect sense to me to have an app that people can use to actually find parking when they need it, if they're willing to use it and pay for it. So anyway, those are my comments.
Amen. And that, I think, answers Mr. Fillmore's question. There are some apartment owners that are not happy with this, whether they're big or small. And there are some that are very much in favor of whether they're big or small. And really what it generally comes down to is if they're not providing sufficient off-street stalls for their tenants, they are not going to be in favor of this because they're being subsidized and getting this unfair advantage. If they are, then they are generally in favor of this. And when we have that little thing about stop disincentivizing redevelopment, that's what we're talking about, because the ones that are being subsidized have an unfair advantage and they're not redeveloping. If we take that away, we are more likely to get larger complexes to come in and provide more student housing with the parking that is necessary, so we don't have these problems.
Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Harding. I know how hard you've worked on this for so long. Couple of thoughts. One is, I'm sort of ambivalent about this. I was just mentioning cost to students with regard to towing. And now we're talking about cost to students with regard to parking, which are obviously related issues. I do think in this case, as opposed to the other case, we are talking about something that is already costing the city a significant amount of money. That is the maintenance of public roads and the provision that they provide for the kind of parking that you were talking about, this great Western culture invention that you referred to. So if there's going to be a cost, and I've had this conversation with students, I mean, you'll never meet a student who wants to pay for their parking, and they're furious when they hear about this idea. And I'm sympathetic up to a point. I mean, I sound like the medical student who was had to do 100-hour weeks and then says, that was nothing when I was young. And in medical school, I had to suffer. You have to suffer now too. I mean, when I was in graduate school in Bay Area in California, parking was just obscenely expensive and ridiculously unavailable. So, that's what I point out to them. It could be a lot worse than it is. So I do think something modest that works. I mean, I know you were sort of alluding to a possible market balance there. I don't know exactly what the balance there might be, but the problem is this complicating factor of the housing change, which you've alluded to. It does seem to me that one impact is that it actually deters students from living in the area because they say, well, I could live, here, but I wouldn't have to pay for parking. Of course, they do have to transport themselves to the campus. Anyway, I know we're all dealing with speculative reasoning in that regard, but that is something that I'm wondering about. The third thing is that I would like to hear, I don't know if staff's prepared to say anything here or at a future point. You mentioned staff review, but I would like to know what they feel is the implication of something like this for their ability to actually make it happen and manage it and run it. I think that's going to be an important factor for me.
Let me step aside and
it looks like Hannah is here to address something. Oh.
So this will take considerable staff resources to enforce. It will take at least one new full-time enforcement officer. But as we are moving toward higher demand for parking in the city, that is simply a trend you're going to see, is us frequently asking for more parking enforcement officers and the means to equip them and send them out on the streets. That's something we're prepared to ask for in the next budget season, although we would hope the absolute minimum for the cost is that the plan has to be able to financially cover itself, including the cost of at least one new full-time staffer. It will add some additional extra hours that aren't already compensated, but staff have said that they're willing to do that. That's within their purview and capability.
Okay, thank you.
And as Mr. Strachan pointed out, and maybe this can focus this a little bit more, we have 990 that's written and is proposed and has the full recommendation of the committee. And I feel like that one should be fairly non-controversial because it doesn't apply it anywhere. I would love if the community engages with it and says, well, hey, here's an idea that's being used out here and you could make it even better. I mean, that'd be great or whatever, but I don't see this as being very controversial. Once you start talking about 991, which would apply it to Joaquin, then that's probably where some people are at a financial, it would be financially disadvantaging to them because they've been relying on free parking for so long, to subsidize their operations. So there will be some pushback on that. Moving forward with 991 does not have full committee recommendation. The committee right now, staff has said that they can't support moving forward with 991 right now. And the committee is not willing to recommend it over their concerns. But here's the question, or here's the dilemma. If we were to suggest now that we want to start moving forward, it would give us a week to prepare an open city hall and prepare information. Maybe it's 2 weeks. I'm forgetting the timeline exactly, but it would give a full month before Thanksgiving in order to actually collect that public feedback. And then we would give it another week to process that public feedback, and it would come back to the council, whatever that week after Thanksgiving would be, for consideration. And then I think that gives us another time or two of council meetings, or maybe not.
Anyway, we can get it done this year. And in some ways, that's my preference. It's always hard to open a public period where the students, that's convenient to the students. Either they're gone for the summer, they're moving in, they're dealing with midterms, they're dealing with holidays, they're dealing with finals, so it's pretty tough. But this one, I mean, we've got like 6 weeks in there. And so we can have a full 4 weeks in the middle of that to get student input. And I think that may be about as good as we're ever going to get. One of the staff's concerns is there's still questions about, cost and making sure it's full cost recovery and all of that. And I totally understand that. My preference would be to do it now. We've got the momentum, and I'm going to be off the council, and so I'd rather get it done now. And then it really doesn't need to be implemented until fall, but there's certain places like along 8th North, it probably makes sense to start doing daytime charging, because there's already demand that's above that. So we could start it really small. We could test it here, test it there, because we have this ability to create parking zones, and we can be flexible and that way we're fully ready for fall. I'll ask staff maybe to talk again about their concerns, but my understanding is they're concerned that if we create it now and may or may not implement it in fall, particularly if they don't feel the app is ready by fall, then it's now like a very long time since the parking, the management area was created before they actually start implementing it. There's a concern about how that looks to the public, and so they would rather wait until they're a little bit closer on the app. To me, from what I've seen, it seems like the app we should be able to have all of that in plenty of time for next fall. Maybe I have such high expectations on what they're able to accomplish, but so I still feel like if the council wants to get this done this year, and then give the parking manager all the time that she needs, as much time as the parking manager needs to implement it, that's great. That would be my preference, but that was my understanding of where the concerns were from the staff.
Mr. Hanley with a follow-up.
Yeah, just in light of what you're saying, I mean, I do think winter semester provides an ample opportunity for student feedback, that maybe it'd be better than trying to pack it in here at the end, especially if, those 4 weeks are finals and all that. I mean, I know we can't schedule everything around students' lives, but
Is finals before Thanksgiving? Do finals happen before Thanksgiving?
No, I was referring to after you. Anyway, I'm just sort of expressing a slight preference for 990 now, 991 to be determined at during the winter for the fall, especially with all the housing shifting going on. It seems like the input from students might even give us some good ideas about what they're doing, what they're planning to do for fall and so on. Anyway, that's just
that's good. Sorry, I know I'm way too verbose, but perhaps if we get a thumbs up, thumbs down on 990 and a thumbs up, thumbs down on 991 for this year, I'm happy not to fight that battle of 990 and hand it off to the next council. It'll save me some arrows, taking some arrows, but I'm also willing to do that and shepherd it through this year if that's what the council wants.
Thank you. Before we do our thumbs up, thumbs down, Mr. Fillmore, did you have a comment?
I did. I had a question. We're making a lot of assumptions. I certainly agree with the assumption that with BYU's change in their student housing policy, we're going to have more students living away and wanting to find parking places because now they're driving further in. That will exacerbate whatever problems we have. I also agree that other universities who have this problem have dealt with it in various forms, and some much stricter than what we're proposing. It's been a perpetual headache at major universities, countrywide, frankly. And I don't believe it's prudent for us simply to do nothing. I think we've got to do something here. I'm just not sure if I gave Mr. Harding an adequate opportunity, or if he didn't take the opportunity to fully articulate the concerns of the landlords. We have a lot of them, and they have major investments in that area. I understand that they would have a concern that they might be losing the so-called subsidy that they've been getting. But David, are there other legitimate concerns they've raised with you? And if so, what was your response, or what recommendations have they made themselves on how to ameliorate the problem?
I've heard concerns that they haven't been involved in the process. We have held landlord focus groups. We have had landlords as part of the broader parking committee on and off for the past multiple years. But if you do legislation long enough, you'll realize that even if you do full open houses and a bunch of stuff, there's always, you're going to get down to the end and people will say, well, I'm just learning about this for the first time, and it's legitimate. But I do feel like we have gone probably above and beyond what's generally expected as far as trying to get input from various groups, student groups, landlord groups, BYU. We really have tried to gather information, but it has been a multi-year process. And so
I acknowledge that. I guess I'm not asking about process. I'm asking about what suggestions they may have made.
I'm trying to think. I have heard, that the complaints, well, you're just trying to charge students and just try to make money off of students. I have heard the complaint like, we've been dealing with this for 50 years. Why are we changing it now? Why, just let the students, fight for the on-street spaces. I have not heard, and that would be, I guess, and I think we may be thinking of the same person, but that's the main complaint. I mean, there's complaints about process, but as far as like ideas of what should we do, that the thought is just don't do anything. People may complain about it, but they deal with it, and they've dealt with it for 50 years. Why change it now? And my suggestion is because it's a major complaint from a major portion of our student or of our city population. And if you've heard of ideas, I mean, we did one of the many, one of at least the two main surveys that we did. I mean, there's all sorts of ideas like, hey, the city should just build a six-story parking garage and allow free parking near BYU. There's suggestions that the city should force landlords to provide free off-street parking to everyone who rents there. There's those suggestions, but as far as like realistic solutions that are meet the goals of what we're trying to accomplish, other than just don't do anything, leave it alone, is the only other suggestion I've heard. If you've heard otherwise, we could spend another 3 years talking about it, but I feel like we've been fairly exhaustive.
Okay. Well, that last question is, one of the concerns I've heard raised is that the Joaquin neighborhood is really two different neighborhoods. There's North Joaquin, which is largely, student apartments, and there's South Joaquin, largely residential, homes that some are rented and some are not. Does it make any sense to look at a bifurcated approach?
I love this. I would love to weigh in on this discussion. I feel like maybe time-wise, we should have this offline, Mr. Fillmore. I really would love to have it. I would just say that we have some awesome volunteers who care deeply about students, and they have the longevity and the institutional knowledge to protect the students and do a great job reaching out to those students. And so these complaints are often from people that don't like what I'll leave it at that. I actually would worry about the students being protected if they did not have someone that was going to be there for more than 4 years.
Thank you. We're actually past time, and we do have a closed session item. Mr. Parker has a comment, and I before I go to you, Mr. Parker, I just did want to mention one thing. I do remember one specific suggestion, and that was, and forgive me, I've been meaning to pass this on to the administration several times, and I just keep forgetting. So I'll just pass it on right now. And a couple of the apartment owners pointed out that when we added no parking signs in certain areas south of Joaquin, they felt like they were a lot farther away from the corner than they needed to be. And anyway, I'll pass that on now, and thank you. Mr. Parker, your comment.
Thank you. Just a couple of very quick observations. First of all, the staff does appreciate the concept of 9.9 to have a very flexible, responsive framework under which we can operate. Just a couple of things as we're thinking about 9.91. After the first of the year, there are a couple of time constraints, and I just would not want you to think that as long as we get it done before fall semester, that will be okay. The last time we looked at this, I think we looked at about 400 parking signs that would have to be installed across the Joaquin area, telling you where's the app to be found, or what to do with people who don't have a smartphone and still want to park. I think we may need to be thinking about some other alternatives besides just parking with an app, paying with an app. The second piece is that many students sign rental contracts at the end of winter semester for next fall. And for them to make informed and educated decisions, they're going to need to know what the ground rules are, and what they can expect to pay for parking, and how that's going to factor in. The other thing I just suggest is that I think, as Councilman Harding suggested, there are some really big unknown implications around the BYU housing policy changes. I think it's very likely, as Councilor Harding indicated, that you'll see this shifting much more to commuter-related parking than resident-related parking. And again, that would argue for greater flexibility, the ability to move boundaries, and those kinds of things. I think the second piece is that with students having likely much greater flexibility, and if we make the assumption that virtually all of the BYU contracted housing that will stay contracted housing will be closer to campus, I don't know if that's a fair assumption, but it seems reasonable. Landlords would be willing to continue to play by BYU's rules if they can get students, if their complex is fairly close to campus. One thing it will give students, they will have greater flexibility to choose where they live, and not just within the 2-mile bubble or outside the 2-mile bubble, but they will be able to pick based on how many off-street parking spaces there are and whether they have to pay for off-street parking or not. And I think that under the current scenario, they have very limited choices if they're undergraduate students. Now that the vast majority of undergraduate students will have less limited choices, they can take more factors into account in deciding where they want to live. It may just not be the ward or the friends or the old missionary companions, but there may be some real serious economic choices that they will be feeling like they need to make. So again, the point I'm making, I guess, is it's just a real state of flux, and it will probably take a couple of years to sort out exactly how this is going to, what the implications will be on housing, parking, other issues in the Joaquin neighborhood. So again, the increased flexibility and the ability to make adjustments on the fly will be really important to implementing a program like this. So those are my only observations. In other words, I don't think we have a delay until June to make this decision, because if that's the case, June to September, we probably can't be ready to make that happen. So
thank you. Good point. So the first question is 990, and we don't actually have to make a final decision on this. All we're trying to determine is if there's at least 4 counselors that are supportive of continuing to work on this and move it forward.
I'd say do we have support to take it out to the public and like really propose it, make it serious and say, we want your feedback because we're thinking of doing this.
Thank you. That's a good clarification. Is there enough support that you're willing to take this to the public and get their feedback? Mr. Hoban?
Yeah, what I was going to suggest was if the language is drafted and ready to be presented, to prepare to come back with that information after having received the opportunity to receive feedback on Open City Hall. That way staff has some clear direction to proceed as if bring you back the information for at a decision point. So I think it's staff, speaking for staff, but typically staff likes to have direction as to what is the next step. To constantly bring stuff back and not have chance for you to vote on and adopt stuff is time consuming for you and for staff. So just having a sense that you want us to bring it back, prepared to adopt it, subject to what you hear from and how you feel about the language then. Okay.
So the language is drafted. I mean, there may be a couple tweaks here or there, but the language is drafted, and I think we're ready to propose it to the public, either just 990 or 990 plus 991. And I think we've looked at kind of the time frame of getting it on Open City Hall and some other venues. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
If we'd like to pass 991 by the end of the year, we would put it on Open City Hall within the next couple of days. We would collect survey responses over the next 2 weeks, take the first week of November to analyze it, and bring it back to the council by November for a vote by the end of November, beginning of December. That's the timeline we're looking at for 91. 90, we can take as much time as we need by the end of the year until we've resolved your concerns and you feel confident you can make a decision one way or the other.
Okay. So, Mr. Harding, are you looking for a motion or just kind of a thumbs up then?
Well, let's do it as a motion. I mean, I'm open to either, but let's do it as a motion, and I'll make two motions. I guess I'll make them. I'll let you know what the other motion is, but I think I'll just make the first motion. The first motion is: does the council directs staff to present this question on Open City Hall and gather public feedback with the idea that the council will vote on it once that process is done. I don't know. Is it someone? Can someone state that better than me?
When you say this question, do you mean chapter 9.90?
Thank you. 9.90. Does the council, I move that the council request that staff put the proposed chapter 990 out to the public for comment, with the idea that we want to make a decision at the end.
With the intent of bringing it back for consideration by the council.
Thank you. That's my motion.
Motion by Mr. Harding. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Hanley. Discussion on the motion, Mr. Shipley?
Yeah, I was going to second that, and I do support 990 and just moving forward with public feedback.
Thank you. Mr. Fillmore?
Yeah, I'm okay with this approach. I think that 990 is a very thoughtful approach. A lot of time and energy and research has gone into it. I like the fact that it's a general approach and leaves us to implement it on incremental basis, neighborhood by neighborhood later on. I'm also appreciative of putting this out for public comment on both the various stakeholders, the students, BYU as an institution, landlords, single family residents can all give us input and then state their positions. That hopefully we get that kind of input that's reliable by the time we bring it back to the council.
Thank you. Any other discussion on the motion? All in favor? Okay, we have three in here in the four here in the chambers. Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yes.
Councillor Ellsworth?
Yes.
So that motion passes unanimously. And Chair, I'd also like to move that, fair or not, in light of Mr. Parker's comments, that we move forward with considering 991 in this time frame as well. So
I'm giving that. I move that, sorry. Go ahead.
Do you want to have a public, you want to have present it to the public and bring it back for council consideration?
Yes, thank you. So that's my motion with the idea that depending on, we will make that decision at that point, whether to go forward with 991 this year or wait till later. But I have a lot of faith in the staff that they'll be able to do this. I also think that gives them the most flexibility, having that in place now so that they can work out what those prices are, what all of those parameters are, so people can be making those contract decisions at the end of winter semester with enough time. So that's my plug for why, but yeah, the motion is just to do the same thing for 991.
Okay, we have a motion by Mr. Harding. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Second by Mr. Hoban. Discussion on the motion. Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, maybe I interpreted Mr. Parker's comments differently than you did, but I sort of heard reason to leave this in the hands of a new parking coordinator with 990 sort of going forward, but allowing us to take the time necessary between now and the end of the winter semester to decide what to do with 991, or was I misunderstanding?
Mr. Parker?
I think you might have been. I think our only concern was that the longer, if there's a desire to move into January in terms of consideration of 991, which was kind of on the table earlier, the concern was let's not let that drag to the end of spring, early summer. Let's get decisions made soon enough that we could move forward. So again, whether you consider these in tandem or whether you consider them sequentially, my main caution was just to say, let's not let it, if we're going to make a decision on 981, let's not wait until, the end of spring, early summer to get that done, because we're just going to run.
Yeah, I don't have that intention. I guess I just heard some reasons. I was sort of nodding my head in response to a number of things you said, which were more clearly stated than what I had felt.
Well, I think
some of the uncertainties, the flexibility. So I would prefer, I guess my point is I would prefer not to move forward right at this moment on 991, but give us a little bit of time with the caveat that we shouldn't wait too long. But that would give us, the end of this calendar year and the beginning of next calendar year to, get student feedback. Presumably we would have a parking coordinator by then, to talk to this person, get their sense, learn a little bit more about implications for landlords of the new BYU policy. I don't know. It just seems like that seems too fraught to rush at this point for me.
Mr. Strachan?
I was thinking that unless you specify specifically in the motion, I think the timing, whether it's sequentially or together, can be a strategy that we look at and decide how to do it in terms of timing, because you'll need time to appropriately do some education. You've got some timing constraints right now. We might be able to get 990 perhaps in 2 weeks, but
If you want 990 done by the end of the year, we need to know today because we have such a short window to be able to work on it. Sorry, I didn't want to push you aside. If you want 990 brought back by the end of the year, we will do our best to do that, but we need to know today if December is our deadline so that we have the time to be able to work with that as quickly as possible.
right, because
On 91, sorry, 90 is good. 91, with all the community work it will take, we need to know today.
Thank you.
so my question time-wise, can we get a 10-day period on Open City Hall and be back with 990 in 2 weeks, and then consider 3 to 5 weeks for the next step to get feedback on 91?
It would be incredibly rushed, and you will hear from the community that there wasn't enough time for feedback from them.
91
We
or
could
90,
do it
on 90 or 91?
on 91.
Okay, so, but we could do the first and then proceed with work.
There's
because
plenty-
91 doesn't matter if council doesn't adopt 90.
Exactly. There's plenty of time for 90. That doesn't take as much community outreach because it's citywide and broad. But if we're going to be applying it in Joaquin, we need to do a lot of work in Joaquin. And that's why we would need to know now is so we could do that targeted work.
Mr. Shipley?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if Mr. Harding will accept the position as our new parking coordinator, then I'll go ahead and I'll be willing to pass 91 right now. But independent of that, I think we probably need to take our time on 91 is my thought. I would love to see 90 come back with public input, be able to address it as a council, have a parking coordinator in conjunction with that we then move forward with on 91. So I as much as I support 91 and as much as I want that, I just think the timing of it might be a little off at this point. And while I don't want to drag it out till June of next year, I think that I think we'll just have a clear indication of how to proceed with 91 once 90 comes back to the council after having public input and being able to pass something.
Mr. Harding.
Thank you. Just some thoughts. These are great ideas. I guess the thought, Mr. Strachan, the thought that we had was, if we choose to just to do 990, we'll go forward with 990 on that time frame. If we decide to do both, we would do them together, and so we wouldn't do two weeks of input on 990 and then 2 weeks of input on 991. We would get 4 weeks of input on both of them. And if we choose not to do 991 and only 990, I'm not sure we're going to get much public feedback because it's just a framework of something that's not being applied anywhere. If what Mr. Parker is saying, and I was nodding along with you, Mr. Hanley, what Mr. Parker was saying about that flexibility and whatnot, I think those are all reasons why 990, just the overall framework, is just a really good tool that's really needed at this time. Generally, it's a good framework because it has all that flexibility built in. If we're looking at work, doing this through October, November, maybe passing it in December versus trying to get it done in January, just remember what happens in January of every other year. We have 2 or 3 new counselors on the council. And we start getting into committee assignments. Sometimes that gets done by mid-February or whatnot. We've got people learning the ropes, kind of getting their bearings. They come with priorities and things that they're working on. And when you meet every couple of weeks, like this committee, it's been, and I've seen over the last 4 years or whatever it's been that we've been working on this, and things roll so slowly. If we don't get it done this fall, this time before the end of the year, I hadn't been thinking, about that whole contract issue. I think it would be hard to get done by the end of the winter semester, if we wait until January to start the process, just knowing all that's going on. If we vote to go forward to the public now, we're going to hear from them. It's going to be painful. We're going to hear from them, but we can always decide once we have that public feedback, we can always say, let's do 990 now. Let's not vote on 991 until later. But if we don't say, let's go to the public now, at tonight's meeting, we don't have enough time as was stated. We don't have time to get to vote. We don't have that choice. We lose that choice for the rest of the year, and then it's going to be tight next year.
I have a question for staff. I felt like we had made a commitment that we wouldn't push 991 forward until staff felt that you were ready. And my understanding from our last meeting was that you didn't feel ready. Has that changed, or what is your current recommendation?
We don't feel ready yet. We feel like it needs more financial analysis. We need more surety with 990 before we can move forward with 991 and present something to the neighborhood that's not just going to change in another couple of weeks. However, staff recommendations are always simply staff recommendations, and policy is up to the council.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
I believe we have after the next meeting, I believe we have 7 weeks between before the last scheduled council meeting of the year. And so I think if we get this first 90 done in the next couple of weeks, then I think we've got time to resolve some of those problems, work on the timing with you. But I recommend if you support a vote for this, then let us work with leadership and the sponsor, the sponsoring committee on the timing of it.
Thank you.
And if I might just add, we are running out of time because we have to be back setting up for the next meeting in about 15, 20 minutes. And so as we move to the next step, I'm just going to recommend that maybe we set up the closed meeting, but we do the start time following the regular meeting, because the administration won't have time to go through their issues to address.
Okay, can you repeat that? That you want to have the closed meeting after
the regular meeting.
After the regular meeting.
But you'll still adjourn, you'll still call it from the work meeting, just at a time after so we can come to it. But I just want to be aware that we've got about 15 minutes before staff needs to come back down and set up for the evening meeting.
Okay. So we need to make a decision on this. That I think I saw a hand. Is there any more comments or questions before we? Oh, Mr. Shipley.
Yeah, sorry, really quick. My comment is, I think as much as it might be nice to get more input from 91 on 90, I think that it might muddy the point of 90 to have just a neighborhood be incensed about their particular part. And so I don't know if that's clear, but I actually think it would be clear, even if we got less feedback, to make 90 its own standalone item for Open City Hall, and talk about, hey, this could apply to Center Street. This could apply anywhere in the city that has high demand parking, for under consideration and issues with parking. I think I like that approach on Open City Hall, independent of just Joaquin. It could be part of it, but I think it might muddy the feedback that we get.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right. And as much as I would like to move this forward, I do feel like I need to have that recommendation from staff that we're ready to go before I can support doing that. Any other comments? And then I'll call for a vote. All right. All in favor? This is 990.
Point of order. I think you've already adopted the idea that we're going to go ahead with 990. I think the question that was put to us was whether or not to move forward with 991. And I've interpreted that as whenever the timing is right, not whether or not we were deciding to do it concurrently.
Right. Okay. So in chambers, okay. Mr. Harding votes in the affirmative. Mr. Shipley?
No.
Mr. Fillmore?
No.
Councillor Ellsworth?
No.
So we have Mr. Harding in favor and the other 6 opposed. All right, thank you. And remind me how I'm going to word this
So when Brian's going to tell you that we have 2 items. And I'll let him explain the items because he says it better. But what I would suggest is that you decide to go into closed meeting, but schedule it for 15 minutes after the regular meeting ends so that we have time to move to that meeting.
Okay, Mr. Jones?
Sure, yeah, I was just trying to think through. I had a different idea in mind, but I think Cliff's works better with the recording. So, yes, we have 2 items, one a personnel issue and one a strategy session regarding sale of property. Both of those are appropriate for a closed meeting under the statute, so it'd be appropriate to close the meeting when you have time to do so. So, yeah, I would suggest a motion to close the meeting with that closed session to be held after the evening council meeting.
Mr. Fillmore?
Yes, I have a dilemma. As I indicated to council earlier this week, I have to leave off at 6:45. I would not be able to probably participate in that closed session. Is it possible to bifurcate that and do a closed session on one of these items. Maybe also do the second closed session after the regular session, but right after without waiting for 15-minute break.
Let me just add, Mr. Fillmore, that we have every intention of being finished before 6 o'clock with the public meeting.
Okay, well, good. Maybe it'll work, then I'll be able to participate.
But word up on the dais here is we're shooting for 5:45, so.
Okay, very good.
So I'm looking. Okay, motion by Mr. Hanley. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Harding. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor here in the chambers? Mr. Shipley,
Yes.
Counselor Ellsworth,
Yes.
Counselor Fillmore.
Yes.
All right, we will adjourn.
Recess.
And
Let's call
see
this,
if
let's call this a recess.
we will recess. Thank you. I always get that wrong.
Go out and play.